Good morning. Once more, I think the same room, same hall, I think. We gather here once more. I'm wondering, those people who believe religion, particularly those Buddhists who believe Buddha Dharma, since our last meeting or last gathering here, how much progress? That's I'm wondering. My part, not much progress. But same determination, day by day, including my dream, I always remember the importance of altruism. So I try my best to increase these sort of experiences. So, in any way, I'm very happy to be here with you. As a human brothers, sisters, we are same human being, irrespective of whether believer or non-believer. We all are seeking satisfaction, happiness, which is our basic right. So, so now the question is, there are various methods. Among those methods, which is more suitable to oneself. And then, once you committed that particular method, then pursue with hard work, constant work. So this now, as in our gathering or teaching, suppose reminds these different methods. Again, I want to emphasize, we are same. That's important. We have same potential. Mentally, emotionally, physically, we are same. Of course, in the physical level, perhaps some face different color, or the shape of nose a little bit different, and color of hair, some differences. These are minor differences. But basically, we all is the same. So very important to get feeling we have same potential. There is always possibility to overcome suffering, to transform one's own mind, can achieve peace of mind, tranquility. That sort of, I think, the belief or conviction is important. Then when we talk about the Dharma or spirituality, this is not just mere academic sort of business. This is something to transform our mental attitude. So therefore, it is important to have the sort of firm conviction. We are same, we have same potential. That's, I think, important. 다들이 시간이 다 LOJONG 랑당 측제무 쉬야체 다 낭추 차대요리 드리 민주산에 내가 디 가사 주디 균자스 모시는
Since the main theme of this series of lectures is based on a Tibetan text which belongs to the Buddhist tradition of practices, so before the lectures begin, we will do some preliminary recitations, and this will consist of paying homage to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the spiritual community, and also recitation of a sutra, a verse from a sutra which encapsulates the essence of the Buddha's teachings, and then finally a recitation of a verse that is aimed at dedicating all the positive potentials towards the benefit of all sentient beings. So we will do that recitation now.
Damba jam de 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 ya wa da jam ba yang da wa so be san je re wa da jam so da ba da wa ra ja ba ji de jam ba ji wo de ka lo jo la na me ba la da me na je da ba san je bai jiao wa sha jia tu ba la sha za lo zhe do jiao zu jiao dan ba zhong den de di xin xie wa da zhong ba yang da wa so be san je re wa da sha da wa ra xia ba ji de jian ba ji wo de ka lo jo la na me ba la da me na je dan ba san je zhong den de bai jiao wa sha jia tu ba la sha za lo zhe do jiao zu jiao dan ba zhong den de di xin xie wa da zhong ba yang so be san je re ba da xiao zong dan ba da wa ra xia ba ji de jian ba ji wo de ka lo jo la na me ba la da me na je dan ba san je zhong den de bai jiao wa sha jia tu ba la sha za这都就是我刚才跟你说，我觉得这啥钱的了，光包的不能，俺年纪点点了，这些说这些开发就了啥子。那到公安小组书上我一些叫做世界轮播的查关系的是那个我公布去年就了啥子，我三说的把这面的。三到这我就了啥子了，对这觉得是不什么去，人民天天讲了啥子了，公布都是现在吧，他们这些别的不不，上他们现在叫做是地形讲了啥子了，大部分的啥子，该应该说的这些许多的到小学吧，西就讲了啥子了，真的这那样的，老板当了这多呢，现在大把现在的跟着那样啥。这个经验没这些，给我不送错过了这，让给生人用说的，今年上街大把人干嘛都是慢慢的，就么在我就我的，没弄老大这都问题解决那么的，山上的他们这是我也过帮当年经济大队的，搞到那到西边老周边，西边说了这我了说，现在上班工作到建给。你实行用了对吧？对当，对下个是对当，你别个还不录住机，你对吧？特别我们的电中这边他家的这边呢，电中去送那个呢，对吧？咱们吧因为在原来这边都能查出，但电中的事情中间的。
We'll now recite two verses. The first one is a verse from Maitreya's text, which pays homage to the perfection of wisdom. And the second is a verse from Nagarjuna's work, which pays homage to the Buddha for having taught the principles of dependent origination.
年对学我所能更新你经，你是真在感业当中了，攀爬向那南西你经，是等对路在瓦岗，刚大洋大等白土脑，那包跟的那说的松巴，年对上说三百说。三界经里用得了长城路，看给电信的王中，高把没把金没把，下把没把大没把，王没把专没把，他在对面真人民，这把你是西等，少白三界嘛那么的，他把得了长城路。到LOJONG是LOJONG是的，看得来的时候呢，第一个来一般都是不下来。
The teaching that is being given here is called LOJONG in Tibetan, which literally means the training the mind or transforming the mind. What is very obvious is that the whole purpose of engaging in training the mind or transforming the mind is to seek happiness.
那대화도 동해서 돼. 다 가다지 소화지 간에 로고도 와. 소외게 저 봐. 저 드리는 전에 그 솔직히 시베 되는 로고고요.
So when we speak about happiness and suffering, we are of course talking about experience of happiness and suffering, experience of happiness and pains. So we are talking about an issue that has a direct bearing on human mind or consciousness.
다 시바스제니 아니 가다베 풍불레 아니 거라 지금 뭐 수두시 대롱 만대롱 가다 디둑 소화가 상관 없도가.
Now regardless of the metaphysical or the philosophical question of whether or not there is such a thing called consciousness that is separate or independent of, that is separate, distinct from our physical reality. Leaving aside that question, what is obvious is that we all, as human beings, naturally desire to be happy and wish to overcome suffering. And that is a fact.
Di kada ngazu ji kasore bana lul bana soa mabsuna en nyongum doa jena ko kada ji soe shebe tene nyongu wa.
And the fact that experience is something that takes place at the level of consciousness, at the level of the spirit, or at the level of mind is obvious, because even when we talk about physical experiences, when we numb a particular part of our body, we can't feel. So it has to do with feeling, and feeling has to do with consciousness and experience.
Da dindegi pegeda soa didu nalia so lusorg luji soe tene didu yongdea rikchikda so lu didu lushik didu zo memche zo samrang tene chik simbo ya yana jikbe.
So when we think about our experiences of pain and pleasure, our experiences of happiness and suffering, the feelings that we are talking about, we can see two categories. One level of experience and feeling, which is more at the level of physical reality, the kind of experiences that we have mainly through interaction, through our senses, sense organs, such as our body and so on. Then there is another level of experience and feeling which has more to do with what can be called mental consciousness or the mind.
That dini durina lusor di semzor bena digi rushi gebe yina shuk chabu chebe yina di lusor tunge sijinan tukurba tele to di semla semne chambuchi majibe yana di lusor dewe sijinan tuya khawchare.
So interesting thing about these two broad categories of experiences is that if the basic state of mind of the person is that the thoughts and emotions are serene and calm and peaceful, then there is a possibility of these experiences being able to even overwhelm a kind of a painful physical sensation, a painful physical experiences. But on the other hand, if the person is suffering from a certain mental depression or anxiety or unhappiness at the level of thoughts and emotions, then even if that person may be physically enjoying comforts, but that person is not really able to experience real happiness.
저당다 LOJONG 스님 가다지다 디두 초와 개첨보다 용대하게 다다 개첨부 다 디두 초 용야 조은 sem게 삼류团에다 정다대비나 아니 다 디기 동행용도다 대화망도다 무상도 심벌.
So what we see here is that our state of mind, the thoughts and emotions and attitudes that really play a central role in our experiences of happiness and suffering. So what is meant by the training of the mind, transforming the mind that we are talking about, is finding a means and methods by which we can channel and discipline our mind so that we can sort of create the basis for happiness that we are seeking.
당아주 지용기 아니 류다 아니 tempa namshini ko tentembe 자오여be 인도산에 류긴 중어 찬유 부충나 야 대지기 즉sem 야 떠서 봐 클레버 용태야 용어 투나 아니 셈 고양지 투den데 고 용거여be 인도산에 다 심기 디지야 전달라 류지 바나지 룽근난조 소로 야나지 류지 중국 소로던데 벤 들게 생각도 용답에는 요가 신데 다지 류지직다 간다직 정다가 타네 아니 직sem 시디야 시디 주야 근데 탑시지 아주 용되기도 하다.
When our physical health is not good, certain afflictions are present at the physical level, it affects our mental state as well. And when there is a greater degree of physical well-being, it also contributes towards a greater degree of mental well-being. And with the recognition of this basic fact, we also engage in certain forms of practices and exercises that help us bring that physical well-being so that it can contribute to greater mental well-being. And also, for example, there are in the traditional practices certain forms of practices that are aimed at sort of training of the energy patterns, what the traditional text call the wind yogas, the prana yogas. And also now in the modern world, some form of yogic exercises, doing yoga practices has become very popular. And we know that through yoga, we can achieve certain degree of kind of physical health, which leads to a mental health as well. So there is that correlation.
다 로종 세야디 조조 다 템반남시 코랑 그 땡네 아니 동해시도다 다 셈조 대화 숙셔 동야다 즉 셈조 동해 숙셔다 다조셈 코랑 그 땡네 두야지 로종들에서 도와.
However, the approach that is being suggested by teachings like the training of the mind is slightly different. Here, we are concentrating primarily on the development of the mind or the consciousness, the thoughts, and transformation of our attitudes and ways of thinking.
This
kind of transformation of our hearts and minds cannot really be imposed. It is not something that can be forced upon us. It has to actually come on the basis of a voluntary acceptance, which is based upon a recognition that certain ways of thinking, certain attitudes, certain way of being is beneficial, and whereas certain ways of being and certain ways of thinking and certain types of attitudes and emotions are destructive. And on the basis of a recognition of these differences, and then you accept, you take upon yourself voluntarily a form of spiritual discipline, that through that way one can achieve transformations of heart and mind.
Any assembly juju tonga singing juju tongdang ke da tapshidi page sem ge nalog namdog nalogi gyawa zani.
The key really here is to have some understanding of the way our thought processes, emotions and so on, and to be able to identify those opposing sides. For example, like in the case of anger, how destructive anger is, and then also understand that there are antidotes within our own thoughts and emotions which can counter anger. And so by understanding the sort of opposing, the conflicts within our thoughts and emotions, and then trying to reinforce and enhance and develop the positive aspects, the antidotes, and try to reduce the force of the negative aspects such as anger, hatred, and so on. It's not sufficient simply to make a wish, may hatred do not arise in me, and may I be able to get rid of hatred. What is required is a concerted effort and also a conscious discipline to which you should apply to try to reduce the force of anger and also try to promote and enhance its opposite, which is the altruism.
So da today this ane sem ge namju dang ran ka so ri namdo ge da chak ru ye da ba da di any those namju dang so rangbo sha sha na namdo chu chu ji ge ba re dan di 다 근데 숨으려서 나와이나 단 대신 뭔가 레임고 봐 남배중의 샤베이나 다 남의 박자가 터는 용대야 다 셰리도 와 곰지다 박자가 터네 자 뒤에 이번 인도산에 다 다당 안 줄이야 지 롤hen지기 지 르지 차나로 여대봐 다 디기 딱 아주 동해 먹고지 용기 봐 인도산에 다 디주지당 거 봐.
So what is required here is to really examine through an introspective process how diverse thoughts and emotions arise in us, and there's of course the philosophical question as to why thoughts and emotions of different types occur in us naturally. Of course, Buddhist philosophy has one explanation. Buddhist philosophy talks about the fact that many of these arises from past habituations or karma, and also what it calls propensities of the human thought and emotions. And when we leave them unexamined and undisciplined, it leads to all sorts of problems and crises and sufferings and misery and so on. So what is required is a kind of a consciously adopted discipline by which we can analyze the nature of these thoughts and emotions and encourage and enhance those positive aspects and discourage and reduce the force of the negative aspects such as anger, hatred, and so on. What is required is the encouragement and promotion of its antidote, which is love and compassion. Now, in the case of doing that, it's simply not enough to recognize that this is what is required, and also it is not enough simply to wish that love and compassion increase in us. What is required is, again, a concerted effort, sustained, continuous concerted effort in cultivating these positive aspects within us. And also, a key really here is a constant familiarity. The nature of human thought and emotions is such that the more you engage in them, the more you consciously engage in them, the more you develop them, the greater it becomes, the greater its force becomes. So that is a fact of human emotions and human thought. Therefore, in the case of love and compassion, one has to consciously develop them, enhance their force. And so what we are talking about here is a way of cultivating a habit, a positive habit, and which is done through what we call meditation.
곰세하게 단다디 드리시기에 바래 가서 말아서 동네 민들부터 대한대 버시 레디 민두신도 동네 મં구지 차대야디 가르쳐 버렸을라나 랑섬지 원도송 나 낭배듯이 자자비나 낭섬지 원도송 랑니 섬지 샹원도송 샘 뇽모베 샹원도송 될 때는 이니 레산의 동네 인구야래 대성도 마세베 지금 남 뇽모 문주와 계점니네 샘럽도 뭐시오치 되는지 그 용어들도 봐. 그래서 이제 이번 인도산에 샘
When we talk about meditation, what exactly do we mean by meditation? Now, meditation from the Buddhist point of view is a spiritual discipline, a discipline that allows you to have some degree of control over your thoughts and emotions. Because from the Buddhist point of view, it is maintained that the reason why we do not achieve the kind of happiness that we are seeking, and we are constantly facing suffering and undergoing misery, is because in our normal life, in our undisciplined state of being, we let ourselves be controlled by our thoughts and emotions. And our thoughts and emotions are in turn controlled by negative impulses, negative emotions, and so on. So what is required here is to reverse that cycle so that our thoughts and emotions are freed from their kind of subservience to negative impulses, and we gain control, we ourselves as individuals gain control of our own thoughts and emotions. Now, we do that through a process of discipline, such as meditation. Constantly, our thoughts are, chased by various events and so on and so forth. So we don't have that kind of focused discipline. From a Buddhist point of view, meditation practice has to choose a positive object, which can then allow you to enhance your ability to focus on that, and then through that familiarity, you become more and more kind of sort of close or intimate to that particular object. So that's one type of meditation, and in the classical Buddhist literature, that type of meditation is described as absorptive meditation or single-pointed meditation. Then that alone is not sufficient. What is required is an analytic dimension as well. So through the recognition of pros and cons of different types of emotions and thoughts, then you'll be able to enhance those positive states of mind which contribute towards your sense of satisfaction and sense of serenity and tranquility and so on, and then you'll be able to reduce those aspects of thoughts and emotions that lead to suffering, dissatisfactions and so on. So an analytic aspect is also required.
검자 미다고다 우리 사잖아. 미다고디 다 가서 깨지긴 직배 등이래 삼배 타 최병하는 로 해니 샤베이나 조금 고민 버리. 조금을 치면 버리.
For example, if you take the example of impermanence, meditation on impermanence as an example, if the meditator or if the individual remains single-pointedly focused on the fact that everything is momentarily existing, everything is transient, everything is impermanent, and remains single-pointedly focused on that thought, that is a single-pointed meditation. Whereas if the person sort of meditates on impermanence by constant application of the various reasons or various sort of indications of impermanent nature of things, and reinforces the conviction through that kind of analytic process, and that is an analytic meditation on impermanence. What is common to both of them is that both can be said to be meditation on impermanence. So the object remains the same. It's the way in which the meditation is applied that is different.
다 전조 검리가 나려야 미버디가 딱다 돼야려야 개인이 바로 제용이 되려야 아니 증오도 꿔봐서 인식도 와.
The traditional Buddhist texts speak about 4 principal obstacles that one must overcome in order to have a successful meditation. And these are at the sort of coarse level of mind, the kind of the naturally scattering nature of our thoughts. We tend to often get completely scattered, and then there is what is called the kind of mental sleepiness. And then at a bit more subtle level, there is what is known as the mental excitement. That is the fluctuating nature of our mind. And then what is known as the laxity, which is what makes our mind kind of unable to retain its kind of vitality.
묵보 침이 줄셔버리. 전다 묵보 세대야되니 가다지 심 그게다 그 검제배 되는지 로그 세부 켜는 매다 배 심파 집에 가서 배. 다 묵보 서로 다 아마 징대로 배 마. 배. 다 가게 배 삼천은 미서지게 되지. 그래서 멍치 되는지. 근데 징이 줄이 징어 말이 잡으래. 디 징이 줄이 잡으래. 징이 준대 시행도 전에 디 징이 줄이 시. 제가 간다 왔다 묵보스 자된 가서 지금 상무스게 과외 되버로 지금 낙토민이 되는 거다 들라 묵보스가 그래. 지상 가서 아니 기본으로 제일 왔다. 되게 배 상무 중국에 배 그도 지금 초디도 배 남도로 담을 시안에 스머지비 되게 다 가게 상마다 이제 이런 거라. 최근 이 서로 최근에 팀 대집에 가돌이야. 애들 식식이 기부였어요.
So
무겁네 기부였었다.
So one of the 4 obstacles, which is said to be mental dullness or mental sinking is probably a better word, is said to be the cause of laxity at a more subtle level, mental laxity. But mental sinking is, in fact, it can be quite pleasant because when our mind is too alert, it is afflicted with all sorts of excitements, and then our thoughts chase after different events and ideas and so on, as a result of which we get either elated or depressed, or when mental sinking arises, it sort of gives you a kind of a respite. Sometimes it can be quite pleasant because it's like a kind of a restful state of mind, but it is actually an obstacle to meditation.
그래서 주다 기대 시민들 해야 돼. 거기서 배지 무보야고 공부도 와. 좋아할 때 있자. 아니 혈류 집에 있는 속에 사발이야. 아니 시민은 거르서 그 배지 무보 공부야. 그래 별시시 시대리도.
So we can see that this mental sinking that we are talking about here, at some level, mental sinking, which is literally the Tibetan word mukpa translates as cloudiness. There's a kind of a cloudy state of mind, So it's something that can be, as I explained before, it can be quite pleasant. And in fact, we can see that even in animals. For example, like if we look at birds and cats, the birds, when they are well fed, then you can see that they are kind of almost in a kind of a tranquil state, completely kind of relaxed. Similarly, when we see a well-fed, happy cat, you hear the cat making this kind of whirring kind of noise. And we can perhaps say that the cat is in this mental sinking state.
다 지원스잖아요. 쌤도 세부 예도 그렇지. 그것도 미국의 세부 예도 다 지원이야. 낭식 차라 먹고 여서래. 차라 숨도 쉐버래. 지원을 봐. 지원 어레다. 지원 딩스로다. 지원 배 차와. 근데 쉐버래. 제가 가다 지원스잖아요.
So mental dullness or sinking that we spoke about is at a much sort of coarser level, whereas mental laxity, which is in a sense a result of mental sinking, is felt much more at a subtle level. In fact, for a meditator, it is said that it's difficult to distinguish between genuine meditation and mental laxity, because the problem with mental laxity of the mind, is that at that state there is a clarity. You haven't lost the focus of your attention on the meditation, but what is lacking is that there is no alertness of mind. And for a serious meditator, it is said that it is very important to be able to distinguish between subtle laxity and genuine meditation, because within the laxity they are said to be different degrees.
초슬럽이나 심 미팅 갈 만에 제제 심 유신리야 초등에 나 들려야 이니 지 롱어된 연구야래 가다지 시당 초와 연구래.
The third factor, that obstacle that we spoke about, is mental scattering, and this refers to very general sort of problems of our thought. When we try to focus on a particular object, we find that our mind immediately loses its attention, gets completely distracted, and it can be distracted by various things which are pleasant, things which are unpleasant, and so on and so forth. This is a kind of a particular aspect of our mind, whereas the fourth obstacle is a subsect of this mental scattering, which is in the text referred to as mental distractions. But here we are referring more specific to distractions to pleasant objects, because the reason for sort of specifying that as a separate class is because in our meditation, what distracts us most is the pleasant thoughts. Some kind of recollections of a past experience, that's something we would like to see, or something that we have enjoyed. So that these kind of recollections of these thoughts often are the sort of major interferences for a successful meditation discipline. So of these four obstacles, the two principal ones are mental distraction and mental laxity.
다 디니기 오래 다드네 목벌이야 배질다 지 가서 야는 지 dob자 망잡에서로 야는 지 니벨 망잡에서로 야지 깔래카에서 되네기도 하니 뭐 용다 용도가 딱 걸거래야 세트지 dob자에 걸어 딱 개치주식디 치주카세 나도 결론이야 좀 되게 치주카세 가서 그게 미로원신 소야디 가다 지 니도 서버야 에너지 류도서 양요야 저거 뭐로야 무슨 가도 저거도 로용이다 제니 가다 이제 되게 송기야래 가도 가바지기다 쌤 그뒤니 친이 나도 리포 탕고요야 딘저와 된데도가 딘저와 된대야래 저리 민주산에 딱 가다 저다 세주 되게 하는 저 숙심버리샤.
Now, as a means of dealing with these obstacles, particularly with mental sinking, the dullness of mind that we spoke about earlier, it seems to have a lot to do with our physical state. For example, like if we are deprived of sleep, we experience this kind of dullness. If we don't follow the right kind of diet, it affects our mind in a particular way. What we eat also makes a difference, and how much we eat also makes a difference. It's because of this, in the Buddhist tradition, for the ardent members of the monastic order, Buddha has advised them not to eat after lunch. And the reason is that too much excessive eating leads to a kind of a dullness of mind. And the reason for that is that when the monks don't eat after lunch, then they can maintain a certain clarity of their thoughts for meditation. And also when they wake up the next morning, and they will have this sharpness of mind.
다 증오해야 돼. 증오해야 아니 셈팡 맞잖아. 셈 낭도 뒤치나. 아니 셈파수 초고를 해야 돼. 또서 용치면 있나요? 아니 셈그 그게 당자로 가서 그게 배르고 중이 가서 배 릭셔로 서버다 배 중셔로고 아니 예 냠주고요. 마당쳐요. 그래서 리민도 전에 다 진외 냠볼이야 셈팡 토르당고요. 셈팡 토르도야게 탑시디 셈을 지금 떠나려고 지금 셈을 배 까나려고 준비는 셈팡 토르고요. 지점 스냅니다. 다 셈팡 토르도 전에 이니 셈마지 배 리보마지 답에 녀업다로지 코인이야 상용고요. 봐. 칭대로야 상용이지. 그래서 리미도 전에 셈팡 혈탑의 왕기 지원용인도 전에 뒤년볼라 셈팡 토르당고요. 셈팡 토르다디 가두제야기 유진데야 참배이나 아니 지원의 세도도.
It is said that the reason why this kind of level of laxity arises in our meditation is because there is not enough alertness, and also the state of mind has sort of gone down too low. So what is required here is to find a way of lifting up your mind, and one of the best ways in which we can do this is try to create a kind of a joyfulness in ourselves, and we can reflect upon our own achievements, positive aspects of our life, and so on and so forth, which then help you bring a kind of a joyfulness within you, and then that will lift up your mind. So that's one of the principal kind of methods for dealing with this kind of sinking mental laxity.
어레 다 증오를 증오 지당 룸어된 야 증오 개와 연구요 증오 참모를 개와 연구요 그래 개외 믹딘 다 개외 믹딘서 어레 셈지 다 믹버 디자 다 그다음에 미다고도 검세 미다고도 우리 옆에 제시도 배도 냠바샤니 셈비게 개심지 차니 여대버지 야 처음에 증오 शु고 그돌이야 아니 증오 개와 되셔요 셈 지지 띵인지로 고도스 아다 개외로 차 다다 근데 개외 미버도 되는 거지 개외 미벌 미대베 다 간다 개외로 차는 여대버디 토마직다 셈팡 템마다 쇼를 소를 제제 근데 지금 지금 참여 내거들라 개와쳐요 그래 지난 지원을 거대 샤샤.
So generally speaking, this mental laxity that we are talking about here is said to be a neutral state of mind, neutral in the sense of virtue and non-virtue. Although the initial stages of mental laxity can be virtuous. For example, if the meditator is focusing pointedly on, say, impermanent nature of life, then at a point when the meditator begins to lose the alertness of that focused mind, then the person is lapsing into what we call here mental laxity. So the initial stages of that still is a kind of a virtuous mind, but generally mental laxity is said to be neutral.
Then that choa, she shang choa develop, she did it. 그걸 거두다 삼다 와다 되네 다지 가나 내버려 치시지도 거바 인도잖아요 다 거바 다 좋아리 배지리 가다 sem팡 토잖아 아니 sem비양야디 숙체야지 그래서 리비드는 sem팡 마르당고요 sem낭도 두고요 아다 저 sem팡 마르당야 탑실이야 아니 지 메다고로 지 나가는 신기 동해외랑 신도 지 근데 삼담비나 야 sem다 스마치 대기베 sem배지 가예로 배 숙체잖아 디 sem배 초고 숙체 무용대하고 야또 sem낭도 두위나 아니 sem팡 마르도 되게
And mental scattering and distraction or mental excitement arises when there is too much excitement or your state of mind is too uplifted, then mental distraction and scattering arises. Therefore, the antidote for that is to find a way of bringing down that excited state to a bit more kind of sober kind of a state. Now, one of the ways in which this can be done is to then reflect upon certain thoughts and ideas that has a kind of a sobering effect. For example, like reflecting upon the transient nature of life, and also the fundamentally dissatisfying sort of aspects of our human existence and so on. And these can have an immediately sobering effect. So that will help you then overcome too much excitement in your meditation.
다 들려야 가다보게 탑시 디디 답게 들어와 탑시 등에 뒤 중내지고 알아 다 두겐디 다 정신이 들으셔 거기서 법에 미국이 맞이버시네 템배송.
So we see that in order to deal with these, address these problems of the four obstacles, and particularly the two principal ones, the mental excitement and mental laxity, what is required is a skillful application of two principal faculties of our mind. One is the mindfulness and one is introspection. And through the application of introspection, we will be able to develop a sort of vigilance that then enables us to see whether our mind in that state of being is under the influence of excitement, or is it distracted, or is it focused, or is it lapsing into a form of sinking. So it is the application of mental introspection that allows us to be vigilant. And once you have observed whatever the state of being is, and then it is mindfulness that allows us to retain our mind fused and focused on that object of meditation. So in a sense, one could say that practice of meditation, the essence of the practice of meditation is the practice of maintaining a sustained mindfulness. Therefore, one can say that practice of mindfulness is the essence of practice of meditation.
And 검강인의 균승이야디 시부진내 좀 저기야래. 아니 검제 남산직 배선료 소주돼서야디 미시브래. 윤승고야래.
So whatever forms of meditation that you may adopt, what is very important is to apply this continuously and maintain a sustained effort. It is unrealistic to expect something from a meditation practice within a simply short period of time. What is required is a continuous and sustained effort.
지당 섬리야 두어태하게 느버디 자고부터 체르샤.
Generally, of the two types of meditation, the single-pointedness and analytic meditation, I would say that it is the latter, the analytic meditation, that seems to have a greater effect in bringing about transformation of heart and mind.
다고 탄예디 자마자레마도셰 즉 비즈니스이네 비즈니스맨이네 그걸 비즈니스 나올배 시부직 자금 지겨워고 애널라이즈 지겨워래 즉 시부직 답게 인베스티게이트 지겨워래 되디 다른 된다가 다시 레리 가다 가나리네 아고라 시부직 잡아 지겨워래 상다다 애널리틱 메디테이션 이메다.
So regardless of whether the term is actually used or not, in fact we find the application of what we call analytic meditation in almost every profession. Say for example for a business person, the person, in order to engage successfully in his profession, has to be very critical, examine pros and cons, and so on and so forth. And so in almost every profession, whether or not we are conscious that this is analytic, we are always applying this analytic faculty.
식시진한테 아다 로종 랑당 식지 식시인 거대 안다 다안에 심전 탐자나 다 사이스도가 당연히 딩어도 상무시 당구야래.
So right at the beginning of these 8 verses on training the mind, in the Tibetan version, the first word is I, may I, the word dag. So for a Buddhist, it is very important to then question, what exactly do we mean by this dag, this self, or I?
다 야갈이야 아니 그게 가소래 따와 두다 몽고지 주변 나라네 나 몽고 다 낭배 체주디 낭배 체버디 아니 풍불의 전신배 다 요마리스.
So one thing that really distinguishes or sets the Buddhist teachings apart from the other classical Indian religious traditions is that the teachings of the Buddha reject any notion of an eternal soul that is independent of our physical and mental reality.
풍불의 전신배 다 캐버시아 인도산에 아니 다 지부 요매봐 어디 시기야래 지부 요매봐 라와 어디 시기도와 저단 데니 요마리스 풍부를 다 써야지 풍부를 때네 연구를 따이네 풍부를 때네야 다 샤유르잖아요 낭배 나라를 맨다고 싶이 되는 거야래.
So Buddhist schools on the whole reject the notion of there being an eternal soul or self, or Atman as the Indian traditions call it, that is somehow independent of our mind, physical and mental aggregates, and somehow that is unitary and something that is unchanging and permanent. And Buddhists on the whole accept that the nature of self or the person has to be understood in terms of the existence of the physical and mental reality of a person. Self or the person can only be understood in dependence upon the psychophysical constituents that together constitute our existence. So, and if we then examine the nature of our psychophysical aggregates, the mind-body aggregates, we find that they are constantly changing. They are constantly changing, therefore the self cannot be unchanging. And they are transient, therefore the self cannot be permanent. They are diverse and multiple, therefore the self there cannot be a unitary kind of an eternal self. So it's on these grounds Buddhist teachings on the whole reject the notion of some kind of eternal sort of unchanging soul.
다 풍부 다당 안 주변에 지금 락배 풍부 락배 수풍도 제대로 번에 풍부 더불어 다 되베이나 다 락배 풍부디 아주 시위님들이 엔 도주고 알아 봐 제장가 아니 된데 다디 소소디 넘버 10이 귤 때는 딱 말해 있어요.
And although all the Buddhist schools maintain that self or the person or the individual has the existence of that has to be understood only in dependence upon the physical and mental constituents of that individual or the person. This is not to say that it has to be understood purely in terms of the gross level of existence, the kind of corporeal existence that we have. Therefore, Buddhist schools on the whole understand the existence of self or a person in relation to the continuum of the consciousness. And then the question is whether the self or a person, whether self has a beginning, an end or not.
다 shirama shunka chene 상민이 된 것도 제일 전에 아니 리포 균체니 페이지다 다사 균 페이지 가베 소지 페이지 등에 요하면로 어디 신 디밍기 나베 좀더 패무치 아니 다사디 타마디 매바리 타마샤야 요마리 토마에 요.
The reason why the Buddhists maintain that there is no beginning to the continuum of person and self is because self is understood in relation to the continuum of consciousness. And as far as the continuum of consciousness is concerned, Buddhist schools on the whole maintain that we cannot posit a beginning to consciousness. If we were to posit a beginning to consciousness, then we will have to accept an instance of consciousness, at least an instance which we will have to maintain is uncaused. It has come from nowhere. The fundamental principle of reality that is accepted in Buddhism is the law of cause and effect, the dependent nature of reality, that everything comes into being as a result of aggregation of causes and conditions. So if consciousness comes into being, it can come into being from no cause, then it defies that fundamental Buddhist philosophical principle. Therefore, every instance of consciousness must come into being as a result of some causes and conditions. And within those causes and conditions, the material cause, if we can use the word, or the substantial cause of consciousness must be some form of experience. Matter alone cannot produce consciousness. Consciousness must come from a previous instance of consciousness. And similarly, if you look at the physical reality, at least from the Buddhist philosophical understanding, that even the physical world, so far as its causal origin is concerned, it is beginningless. We can reduce a physical object to its constitutive elements, then the atomic parts, then into molecules and so on. And even these has to come into being as a result of some other causes and conditions. So in a similar way, the consciousness is also beginningless. And similarly, the consciousness is also said to be endless, because so far as the basic existence of this faculty for knowing and this faculty for experience is concerned, there is nothing in reality that undermines its existence. A certain state of mind, such as our sensory experiences, which are contingent upon a certain physical existence, may come to an end when the physical basis ceases to exist, say at the point of death. But so far as the subtle aspects of the consciousness is concerned, particularly what the Buddhists call the luminous nature of consciousness is concerned, it is said to be continuous, and it is said to have no end. So it is on that basis Buddhist schools on the whole argue that so far as from the point of view of continuum is concerned, self has no beginning nor end.
Today you do that shebe gu da sheba ada sheba yezalo didia ka kasuri kora sugjen sore. Mr. Rob Laboratory. Ma shebas lebdia dodor chig samdam doga. Shebas lebdia be jashim shibji ko namra mongu shibji. So that di peje nga shungni shadia ko peje kwachim tayari sha sheba chara mongu shaji. So that digi tene ini sheba rakba dizutedi ini kanda pungul tende be sabshare kanda ten rakba pungulia jasha yedo be sabshare. Bana wangshi de da leyi. So today me dusane da 풍부 소과를 때네 풍부 딱진 전이 거야 수진 풍부 딱진 전이 야 시바야 깨야기.
So when we talk about mental phenomena or consciousness or mind, generally in our sort of unreflected state of mind, we tend to have the kind of impression that it is some kind of single monolithic entity called consciousness or mind. But that's, however, not the reality. Even when we sort of probe a little bit deeper, we'll see that it is a diverse world of diverse thoughts, emotions, sensory experiences, and so on. And many of these levels of thoughts and emotions are very much contingent upon our physical existence. For example, all the sensory experiences are very dependent, very contingent upon our bodily existence. And of course, these will come to an end when our physical existence comes to cease. So when we talk about the Buddhist understanding of the continuum of consciousness being, beginningless, we should not confine our understanding of the nature of mind or consciousness to that gross level of existence. But rather, what the Buddhists are talking about is a subtler level of consciousness. Now, the Buddhists would argue that there is this underlying luminous nature, which is the mere fact of experience, the mere fact of cognition. And it is this faculty, or it is this phenomenon or entity that retains its continuum and allows, when certain senses come into contact with certain physical objects, to these kind of different perceptions and so on. So now this underlying luminous nature of our consciousness is what retains the continuum and transcend kind of a temporal existence of a particular lifetime. And this is what maintains its continuum. So when Buddhists talk about the beginningless nature of consciousness or continuum of consciousness, it is from that point of view one has to understand.
다 숙쟁기 균래야 통마 야마서 두자네 야 합가능상 저르데 아니 빅방 용기야래 아니 디콘래야 그리셔스라베나 다 빅방야 거래야 뒤진 고와라.
Of course, immediately in some people's mind the question may arise, what about the Big Bang? Isn't that the real beginning of the physical universe? For a Buddhist, of course, it cannot be accepted as the beginning of the physical world. There are still questions as to why the Big Bang occurred. What are the conditions that led to the Big Bang, and so on and so forth. So from a Buddhist philosophical point of view, even the physical world cannot be said to have a real beginning. Of course, a particular universe, a particular planet will have a beginning. But when we talk about there being no beginning, even for the physical world, we're talking at the subtle level and universe as a whole. So now, what all of this points towards is this fundamental Buddhist philosophical principle of cause and effect. And in order for cause and effect to be accepted properly and understood well, one has to be able to apply this principle in every single instance, and also at the wider macroscopic level. Now the reason why Buddhist teachings emphasize the understanding of cause and effect is not because it is a kind of a law in some sort of divine sense, but rather it is to allow us to have a deeper understanding of the nature of reality. Now, the reason why we conclude that there must be this fundamental law of cause and effect is because we know from our experience and also through our observation that things and events do not come into being randomly. They observe a certain order. There's a certain kind of correlation between certain events, causes and conditions, and also they do not come about as a result of no cause, no reason. So, and once we exclude these two possibilities of random existence or coming into being for no reason or no cause, then we are forced with the third alternative, that is to accept that there must be an underlying principle of causation that is operating at the fundamental level of reality and existence. And now, of course, one can ask questions, for a Buddhist practitioner, why is this understanding of cause and effect of reality so important? Now, the reason is because in Buddhism, there is a tremendous emphasis placed on transforming the mind and heart, bringing about inner changes, and at the level of understanding. Now, it is said that in Buddhism, much of the techniques and meditations and teachings for transformation of mind and heart is based upon something that exists out in reality. Because if reality does not accord with your meditative practices, then there is no real ground for expecting any progress and any development. So therefore, it is through cultivating understanding of the nature of reality, and it is through enhancing and developing that understanding, one can then begin to apply the meditative techniques and practices.
미두기 가서 대장이 몰래 거면 송기야래 다 대답이야 셰외 좀 말봐 그 매배 곰대지 그다음 되게다 매곰사지 그냥 곰리야 매곰사 다니 제용도가 그래서 그 럭시 말이세요 럭시도 셰진고요 셰진도 럭시리 자 다들 인도 섬을 교주 태야는 되게 라버나시 섬을 교주 태야승인데 견제 대바지기 양다바지기 때문에 아니 섬을 이치 네번년이 섬을 교주 태기를 마도 지금게 아니 심매대바지기 경제 양다 매대바지기 아니 독배 섬을 주자
Of course, there are certain types of practices which are specifically adopted to counter specific problems. For example, in the Buddhist meditation, in order to sort of reduce the intensity of one's sexual desire or attachment, there are meditations such as visualizing the entire face of the earth being filled with skeletons and so on. Now, these are specific meditations adopted consciously to deal with specific types of problems. And even in these cases, the meditators do not believe from the depth of their heart that this is reality, this is a picture of reality. There is a full recognition and awareness that this particular image, particular visualization is consciously, deliberately adopted to deal with certain emotions and so on. But generally, in the Buddhist practices, a tremendous emphasis is placed on developing a reasoned conviction in a particular issue, so that on the basis of increasing one's conviction and understanding, then it begins to have an effect on one's heart and mind. So it is through, generally it is through enhancing one's understanding and knowledge and of the reality that the change really takes place. So when we talk about insight and understanding, we are of course talking about insight into the nature of reality and understanding of the nature of reality. That's why this developing understanding of reality is said to be such a crucial element of the whole Buddhist spiritual practice.
랑싱 다에네 동해 면대바다 대완대바 레디 이네 다 아주 동해 망구지 용되게 봐 데네 다 낭배치고 나로네 이노 다 같이 뒤로 영어로 삼천수 가서 우리 진실로 다와시스 미닥발라 딱버시엠바 동해발라 대화시엠바 안다 다음에 발라 딱도시엠바 안 그래 should 그래 should 그래 거 the fourth I forget 장대 딱 다시 네 무사원을 당하지 마 장대 딱 다시
So although although we all possess this natural aspiration at a very fundamental level to be happy and overcome suffering, so what we wish and what we seek is happiness. Although this is a natural fact, but it is also a natural fact that constantly and often we face sufferings. We undergo painful experiences and we face sufferings. So from the Buddhist point of view, then the question is asked why this is the case. Why, despite our fundamental aspiration to be happy and overcome suffering, we are constantly confronted with sufferings and painful experiences and misery. From the Buddhist point of view, the reason given is that there are certain fundamentally flawed ways of relating to the world or perceiving the world, at the root of which are what the Buddhists identify as 4 false perceptions. One is to view things and events which are in reality impermanent and transient, but we tend to view them as eternal. We tend to view them as permanent and unchanging. And also, in reality, things and events are in the nature of suffering, in the nature of they are sources of dissatisfaction. But often we tend to view them as pleasurable, real sources of happiness and so on. So that's the second false perception. And the third false perception is that often we tend to apprehend things which are in reality impure as some kind of pure and desirable. And then the fourth false perception is we tend to project a kind of a notion of real existence, some kind of self-existence to many of the events and things which in reality lack this kind of independent self-existence.
다 근데 이번 인도산에 뭐그 내수를 식네 아니 다 냠는 수 자인도산에 아니 배제 다가다가 차지 시세야디 인사를 삼천기 뒤제ਸਮ지 메다고 사제탐지 동요 최탐지 동시 다메바 양안된다바 시와 세네.
So on the basis of understanding these dynamics of how fundamentally flawed perceptions of reality lead to a certain false view of relating to the world and one's own self, and how this leads to confusion, misery, and suffering, and so on, then Buddhist teachings talk about what are known as the four axioms of the Buddhist teachings, these being that all things and events are impermanent and transient, all things and events are impermanent and transient, and all phenomena which are products of contaminated causes and effects are in the nature of suffering, and all phenomena are devoid of self-identity and existence, and the release from the suffering is the true happiness or nirvana, true peace.
두신 책은 깨지마스 두진지 그래서 다 두자와 두진 두베 타네 최신 두바 깨바 지 인신제라 아니 미다버란 시리스.
So one of the fundamental insights that we find in Buddhism is the understanding that all things and events are impermanent, and this is the first of the four axioms. And here the understanding is that anything or any event that comes into being as a result of aggregation of causes and conditions, by their very nature of being caused by other conditions, by their very nature of being conditioned, in itself indicates that they are impermanent. They are in the ever-changing process. Now, as far as the transient nature of things at the gross level is concerned, we all are aware that how certain things come to cease, how things go through a process of change and so on. But the Buddhists would argue further that underlying this perceptible change that we can all observe, there must be a subtler level of a change, a process that may not be so obvious to us, but that everything is going through this change, even in a single moment. It's momentarily changing. So for something to allow for a change over a period of time, the process of change should be, at least in principle, one should be able to reduce it, narrow it down to a minute point, even within which there is a constant change. That is a dynamic process. So the end sort of insight that is drawn from this is anything that comes into being as a result of other factors, anything that comes into being as a result of causes and conditions, by that very nature makes them impermanent. By that very nature makes them transient.
That this almost not enough. Around that, David Digine Dado, Mindibi Tungine Dado, Tinigalo, could you want to have a Ranshin Change? Child. So today, in do the Jan Dane, George Rashmi Duzane, Tada Tunga Yudavici, Kosea. Tada Mandu Devachi, Drayadava. The quality.
Happiness and suffering do not come about from nowhere. They come into being as a result of their own causes and conditions. And this very fact suggests that although, for example, one may be at present going through and undergoing a painful experience, an intense suffering, but since this event or experience is a result of causes and conditions, that very fact suggests that this will pass. Again, this will change. So we will understand that happiness and suffering are subject to changes, and they are impermanent.
다 대삼식이 아니 대화의 주야요리 동행의 주야요리스럽도야 집으로 차송분이 단 이번에 사배 유중 미당이 동행이
As far as the fact of impermanence or the transient nature is concerned, there is an equality between happiness that we all aspire to attain and suffering that we all naturally wish to avoid and overcome. So in that sense, there is a parity between the two. But then the second axiom points out the real difference between happiness and suffering, because it suggests that all contaminated phenomena, the phenomena that comes into being as a result of pollution, are fundamentally dissatisfying or unsatisfying. And implication here is that those phenomena that come into being not through such causal process can be satisfying or can be fulfilling. So when we talk about contaminated phenomena here, from the Buddhist point of view, we are talking about events and experiences that come into being as a result of negative thoughts and emotions. And any experience or event that takes place or that comes into being under the power of negative impulses, afflictions of mind and thoughts and emotions, they are said to be polluted, they are said to be contaminated by these pollutants of mind. And these are said to be fundamentally unsatisfying. They are said to be fundamentally dukkha, which is often translated as suffering. So they are, in the final analysis, in the nature of suffering. Is it possible to overcome these pollutants, these negative thoughts and emotions, these pollutants? And that's the question.
So that the digi nyumo said that the tunge zawa imbati dan mo chai ngyo di me ndu sane ta ngan zu ji ka so nyumo said ta da tunge zawa da sakba.
By pollutants, the Buddhist teachings are referring to the afflictions of mind, the afflictive emotions and afflictive thoughts. And the Tibetan word is nyonmong, or Sanskrit is klesha, and it refers to a whole class of thoughts and emotions which are by their very nature afflictive and negative. And the etymology of the Tibetan word nyonmong suggests that it is that which afflicts from within, and afflicts in the sense of causing suffering and pain. The root of suffering really lies within us, and root of also happiness also lies within us. Spiritually transformed state of mind leads to happiness. Undisciplined state of mind, a mind that is under the power of afflictions, lead to suffering.
Tadi anda tegi da ge midaba da dujen je midaba sa da kunida man drain ji sam sam be na ani gyujin ji du cheshin ani droba 탐자로 ani keji ki jigdu ya res ta keji ki jigya de ani ya 가서 우리 그게
Anything that comes into being as a result of causes and conditions are, in the final analysis, do not have any independence. They are in the process of ever-changing. They have no real control to sort of stand on its own. And also, that the changing process does not require any other third factor. The very causes and conditions that sort of gave rise to their origination are the very causes and conditions that also planted the seed for their cessation. So, and it suggests that whatever things or events that come into being due to causes and conditions lack independent power. They come into being, they are other powered, they are determined by other forces.
세븐이 몸에 상황도 송. 다 전체적인 내수고 안에 다 지 사무실 담배이나 차보다 가르쳐야는 서서 도가 사무실 다나.
we let ourselves be ruled and controlled by our thoughts and emotions, and we let our thoughts and emotions to be determined and controlled by our negative impulses, the pollutants, the afflictions of mind, and so on. But if we continue to allow this, then it leads us to misery and suffering. So we begin to appreciate that point. Thinking along these lines, we'll be able to begin to really perceive afflictive emotions and thoughts as genuine destructive forces.
So they think which bring disaster or harm on us, that's the enemy. So the ultimate enemy is within ourselves. Oh, that's difficult, isn't it? If enemy they're outside, we can run away, we can hide, we can deceive even sometimes. But if the enemy here within ourselves, oh, difficult. Now the next question is very important. Whether there is possibility to win over this enemy. Now this is the ultimate question, very important question. 다 nyumo 봐야지 매나 무디 잡아왜 좀 된다는 난신 지마섬 이런 신을 주고 알았어. 아니 지시섬 이거 뜻이도 있네. 지마 여여 버리지. 다 들으시면이나 다 알아지나? 아니 창동 알아동 아니 배도 기부신 되는 약실이.
So the real question at the critical
question.
사무스게
마담체. 나도 배지 미상로만고 천주만고 영향이 밀레 튼루 상목하게 맹한데 추지동 더제제세 니면 기부로 시대에 배지 기부였어요. 딘다시 체는 가서 상목만고 가게 다 먹어체. 라이네 가래 참바지체. 아니 기부지 대신 다 약실 봐.
So the critical question for a spiritual practitioner is whether or not there is a possibility to overcome this inner enemy that is within all of us. So that is the critical question. That is also the challenge. And if it were the case, as suggested by some ancient Indian philosophical thought, that the pollutant really lies in the very nature of consciousness itself, that they are inseparable, that so long as consciousness exists, these pollutants will exist as an essential characteristics or nature of our consciousness, of our thoughts. If that were the case, then it suggests that there is no possibility of overcoming them. And if that is the case, and for me at least, then I would rather than be hedonistic, don't even make the effort, sort of seek solace in alcohol, maybe some other thing, some other external substances, and then just forget about the whole thing. And also, do not engage into these kind of philosophical or spiritual kind of probing questions. And sometimes it does seem that if you compare human beings with animals, sometimes we human beings are so caught up in our power, imagination, and thinking that sometimes we create our own kind of complications and complexities.
So this brings the third point.
So this relates to the third axiom that all phenomena are empty and devoid of self-existence.
디 동시 담아서 매배 계시 말봐. 안데 동시 비시기시길. 이 가가 야마스 라빈데 동시 하고 때 말봐. 자, 디 계시 말이. 다디 가르스라나 난수 로리야. 아니 지 낭세로디 나오는시 담바 매대버지. 다가나 낭내 밑에 여대버디 셰기.
Of course, the third axiom that all phenomena are empty and devoid of self-existence should not be understood in terms of some kind of nihilistic sort of way, thinking that then the Buddhist teaching suggests that in the final analysis there is nothing exists, but that's not the case, because in fact we are talking about suffering, we are talking about happiness, we are talking about what is the best means to fulfill this aspiration to be happy and overcome suffering. So certainly we are not suggesting that nothing exists. But what is being suggested in this third axiom is that there is a fundamental kind of disparity between our perception of the world and self and the way things really exist. Things do not exist in the manner in which we tend to believe that they do, as some kind of independent, real, objective out there.
Tadi nyumo seadi ene ngaranzu sem serigi.
Now, as to the question of whether or not these negative impulses and emotions such as anger, hatred, and so on really reside in the essential nature of our mind and consciousness, we can make a little observation. We can examine ourselves, our own experience, and see whether in every instance of our conscious state, is anger there? Is hatred there all the time, perpetually? That's not the case. Sometimes anger arises, hatred arises, then they disappear. But it is not the case that, whenever consciousness is present, that these negative impulses and these negative emotions are present. Sometimes anger arises, sometimes hatred arises, sometimes they're opposites, such as love and compassion arises in us. So what this suggests is that, the basic mind, the consciousness, is clouded by whatever thoughts and emotion that occurs at a given time. And it is also a fact that, say, for example, like hatred and love, they cannot coexist at a single instance. This suggests that anger and hatred and these negative emotions and impulses, they are not ever present, inseparable parts of the essential mind.
So the basic mind is something like neutral. That mind can be influenced by positive thought or emotion, or on the other hand, negative emotion can influence. So now here, it shows there is some hope. Now another point. Yes, certainly, basic mind or main mind is more or less sort of neutral. So there are, and then also I mentioned this morning, two thoughts opposing each other, contradictory. That also there. Now the question is, so therefore, under that circumstances, yes, we can see, we can feel, yes, we can reduce these negative emotions. Now the big question is whether these negative afflicted emotions can really uproot it or not. Now this is now big questions. 다한테 차단 걸로 깨유잖아요. 다 녀몽 남샤 말아서 남배슝 참여 나로리야. 남배도 참여로 나로 녀몽 남샤.
Of course, one can talk about dharma in the context of certain ethical practices, say of restraining from killing, the ethical restraint of not telling lies, engaging in virtuous activities and so on. These are, in a sense, dharma, but these are dharma in a very general sense, that is not particularly unique to the Buddhist teaching. The unique understanding of dharma, or the spiritual practice, in the Buddhist sense, has to be understood in relation to this possibility of total cessation of negative impulses and of thoughts and emotions, which is jhana, a total release and cessation of the afflictions of mind. For example, when Buddhists talk about Buddha Dharma, the real Dharma is the nirvana, that is the cessation of these negative thoughts and emotions.
녀몽 기루당 아니 녀몽기 그게 다소다 싸와 한 대셔로 멋이 좀더 시작하기 남버도 시작하고 숨겨야지 이내 패지 좀더 공마조 샤바드 패지 서버 있어요. 샤링 있어요.
Nagarjuna says in one of his works that nirvana or liberation must be understood in terms of the freedom from afflictions of thought and emotions, and also the karmic actions that they give rise to. the sufferings are caused by our karmic actions, and the karmic actions are in turn motivated by the underlying forces of negative thoughts and emotions, and they in turn are produced by or caused by our projections and imaginings, and which in turn have their roots in a false perception of reality. So this false perception of reality here refers to sort of perceiving things and events as enjoying some kind of objective, real, independent existence.
자, 다 안다데 되게 안다. 다가다 샤지신한 거 숨버데 최탐지 동시 다음에 봐. 시다 되게 최남지 인로데 동시 다음에 말이지. 아니 말한주 로리아 아니.
And then the Nagarjuna says that it is the insight into emptiness that can really dispel this this fundamental ignorance or a misperception of the world, a misperception of the reality. So this relates to the third axiom, that all phenomena are empty and devoid of self-existence. And what this suggests is that although in our kind of normal perception, we tend to believe things and events and the world to be in some sense kind of permanent, in some sense real, and in some sense enjoying some kind of independent self-existence. But in reality, through analysis, we find that in reality, they lack such self-existence, they lack such independent existence.
자상가 자시로 간다 책 동반니 기 각바지로 사야지 제자자 인자네 봉직 년표강 수자 와다 라든자 동반니 투 각바지로 쓰네 라든자 인자네 점치 인수 시세 인디 동반니 자네 심지 취
The emptiness, the insight in emptiness is what allows us, what enables us to really dispel and eliminate the negative thoughts and emotions, the afflictions, and also their underlying false perceptions. And also one can say that it is within emptiness that all of these pollutants are cleansed. Therefore, the point is that one has to understand, one's understanding of nirvana in the Buddhist sense must be based on some understanding of emptiness.
다양한데 디지털 민족이. 다 나중에 거기 삼는 고도가 다 디마 도스 대세게 뒤직대 임벼서도 다 있는데 아니 뭐 통화 가야랬을나. 또가 단디 디편부샤도 안디 사제한테 남자 숨베 그돌이야. 아니
when we think along these lines, someone might think, oh yeah, it all sound rational, fairly rational. It all seems to make sense. But what evidence do we have that we can take what is being presented here as valid, that these thought processes really mean something? What proof there is? Well, you know, something that is observable, something that we can feel, we can experience. And here I would like to refer to an idea that I find personally very useful, which is traditionally taught in the Sakya lineage. According to this teaching, there is an understanding of what are known as the four valid factors, these being the valid scripture, valid treatise or commentarial literature, and then valid teacher or a spiritual mentor, and a valid experience. Now, it is said that in terms of origin, in terms of origination, of course, the valid scriptures were first taught and valid commentaries were written on them, and then on the basis of the study of these valid commentaries, there were valid teachers who became masters of this commentary and then led to these valid experiences. But from the point of view of one's own personal kind of development of conviction, it seems that the order is reversed, that one must first begin with some kind of personal experience. Say, for example, in the case of reflecting upon the four axioms or the empty nature of phenomena, or maybe thinking about the benefits of the qualities of altruism and so on. Unless one has some kind of taste, some kind of personal experience, a glimpse of that, there is less chance that the person will be deeply inspired to carry on. Of course, when we talk about spiritual experiences, there are different levels, there are different degrees. There are profound levels of spiritual experiences and realizations that which I, for one, may not have, but there is also kind of a more initial levels of spiritual experiences which we all have. For example, in my own case, when I think about the virtues and merits of compassion and altruism, as a result of the thought processes, I feel deeply inspired, deeply moved, and this kind of deep inspiration and moving experiences then increases my own admiration towards the masters who personify these great spiritual values and teachings. And then one can also begin to appreciate and also begin to believe that perhaps there is something in the biographies that are of the great masters, where there are narrations, there are accounts of profound spiritual experiences. Of course, when we talk about anecdotal stories, when we talk about biographies, of course, one has to accept the fact that there might be, in some cases, exaggerations, particularly biographies of lamas or masters written by their own disciples. Perhaps sometimes there is an over-enthusiastic presentation of the gurus or the master's spiritual qualities, but still, one cannot dismiss the whole class of biographical. For example, in relation to this point about exaggeration, His Holiness was saying that sometimes when I read very sophisticated commentary written by a great scholar on a short text written by one of his masters, the commentary is so sophisticated and detailed and comprehensive that one begins to even wonder, did the author of the original text, the short text, really knew all of this? So let me carry on with the translation. So His Holiness was saying that, once you have some taste of your own personal experience, when you feel deeply inspired and moved, then you begin to develop deep admiration in the kind of the life of the great masters who embody these spiritual values and teachings. And then, of course, I personally find this way of approaching the teachings very helpful, so that you begin from your own personal experiences, that there is some kind of basis within yourself. And the 8 verses of training the mind by Langri Thangpa is a training for the development of the altruistic aspiration. So these 8 verses of training the mind by Langri Thangpa is a teaching on the practice of bodhicitta, the altruistic intention to attain full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. That wish to attain enlightenment arises on the basis that, it is for the sake of sentient beings that one must attain full enlightenment. So one could say that this bodhicitta, the altruistic intention, is the highest level of altruism. As Lama Tsongkhapa says in his great expositions of the path to enlightenment, bodhicitta is this altruistic intention is such that as you are engaging in fulfilling the wishes of other sentient beings, one's own self-interest are achieved as a byproduct in the process. And in a way, one could say this is a very wise way.
I think really wonderful, very wonderful. So the more sort of, I think the stronger feeling of the taking care of other, oneself get immense benefit. Oh, that's something very wonderful. I think very good. 다가는 신다 장주성 그 편성이 되잖아요. 아니 장주성 샴페인 로지 결하잖아. 현다게 배다 초 상상 전에 배서 초 시부직다 가서 우리 배 깔래져가 되리 이 장주성이 초조야 대라도 조용해. 루주가다.
If we think about the qualities, the positive qualities and the merits of bodhicitta, the altruistic intention, we find that one could say that bodhicitta, or the development of altruistic intention, is one of the most effective means by which one can accumulate merits, one can accumulate the positive potentials, one can enhance one's positive spiritual potentials. Overcoming negative impulses and enhancing positive potentials is really the essence of the spiritual path to enlightenment. So one could say that it is one of the most effective, one of the most powerful spiritual practices.
다가는 신기 아다 자본금 아다디 참명 나눠리야 년절 남는 도지신 투리 남는 럽던 그것이 매번 전기에 상주성을 찬사로서 쉽지도 않아. 년절에 타야 돼 뒤치야래. 가서 그게 간다 미기 주분 그 추중기 년절에 타와 지기야래. 아다 전주 그 심기 다 년절에 타와 제약이 배터 가서 미기 주분 그 추중 배 연줄 동주를 타고 지 니베체래도.
And also Maitreya states in one of his aspirational prayers that it is this bodhicitta that can free us from migrations into lower realms of existence, and also it can lead us to higher, fortunate rebirths, and this is also the path that can lead us to the state beyond death. And what is Maitreya saying here is that the practice of bodhicitta really surpasses all forms of ethical practices or morality. It's a far superior path. It's like a technique that is so comprehensive that it contains the element of all the other practices.
아니 닝도라 닝도 보면 샤베 있나 차고 네 루주관들 지시하는 소원은 시리 아니 사도 추다 메달로 맨덕건 배신신도 다도 섬제 탐지 랑갈감이 제자셔스 섬제 나로 소아시고 달라다 체방쇼 달라다 딩미지 다기 말로 되미쇼 스자네 시비도가 닝도 시비도가 돼.
In Nagarjuna's precious garland, he says that just as earth, the element earth, fire, water, and wind, and so on, and just like the physical universe, the environment, which are being utilized by all sentient beings, may I too be servant to all beings. May I always share my own wealth, positive qualities and so forth with others. May I take upon myself all the negative characteristics, aspects of other beings, including their pain and suffering and so on. So one can see that in the ideal of bodhicitta, in this altruistic sort of ideal, we can see a tremendous amount of courage reflected in this practice.
디에디 로중이 깨와중이 계신 말에 준준의 소원이지 지시 난간 내봐도 좋아 지시 내줘 봐 지시 단에 내주는 저동에서 없어도다 다 전에 젠도 메벨로리도.
And also such courage of sort of expansive altruistic kind of thought, reaching out towards all sentient beings is not limited to a particular kind of a period or a time. It's unlimited. For example, we find a verse in Shantideva where he states that as long as space endures, as long as sentient beings remain, may I too remain and dispel the miseries of the world. You can see that there is this tremendous courage that is kind of, in some sense, transcends the boundaries of kind of individuality, boundaries of time, and so on.
딘데기 남주적인 로티 싫어고 좌도 제베터네 용되게 가래.
And such powerful altruistic mind comes about, supported or reinforced by the faculty of intelligence, the faculty of wisdom.
자상가 딘데가 탑 정주고 셈다. 정주고 셈 대심배 돈이 무슨 뜻다고 해. 로텔이야. 아니 단담 정주고 셈서도 와. 그래서 군조 정주고 셈도 단담 정주고 셈서 디니부터 직다 가서 우주 시대부터나 아니 뭐는 폭거 버려. 뭐는 믿고 쳐버려. 다와도 탄다도 총어래.
So this bodhicitta, this altruistic intention, when it is reinforced and complemented by the aspect of insight into emptiness, particularly the direct realization of emptiness, then one is said to have attained the two aspects of the bodhicitta. One is the conventional, then one is the ultimate. And so once the practitioner has within himself or herself these two practices, the altruistic intention and the wisdom factor of understanding emptiness, then he or she has within their hand the full tool or method for attaining the highest spiritual aspiration. And such a person can be said to be truly great and truly admirable.
Anyone 가서 대 나자고 송는신 그것들이 샤양가고 대교와 강배교고 테니교 강배 dundu다네 개별론기 숙도지 개별인데 자주 바로 쳐들어서는 억시 주주세죠.
And then if one is able to cultivate these spiritual qualities within oneself, then as Chantakirti writes very poetically in one of his works, that when one possesses the two wings, the wing of altruistic intention and the wing of insight into emptiness, then one can cross the entire space of reality, thus going beyond the state of existence and to the shore of Buddhahood, full enlightenment. And one can do that by in a sort of a self-congratulating way. The Tibetans do this.
다 샹든 tö니기 장니 청주 tö니기 아니 충전신 시대전에 샹든 tö니기 냐르지 이나야.
Now here, when we talk about aspiration to bring about others' welfare, here, of course, one can think about relieving others from very obvious sufferings of pain and so on. But in the profound Buddhist sense, this is not the meaning. The meaning of bringing about others' welfare here really refers to helping others to attain liberation. So therefore, some kind of understanding of what is meant by liberation has to be developed first.
자다 되게 고는데 세주시베다 동력 다와디 대 십실레무도가 동력 고아지 마찬아 탈바스야디 시드 미시 태좀도 봐. 드리베 이르선에 탈바 태좀 세베이나 미네베냐한테 태좀 세그리 아니 셴도 되냐면 누가.
So again here there is a direct relevance to what we have been speaking about earlier, which is the understanding of emptiness, because nirvana, as defined by Buddhism, Buddhist teachings, really has to be understood in terms of understanding of emptiness. So, and without some understanding of emptiness, there is no real possibility of understanding what true liberation is according to Buddhism. And without having that kind of understanding, one's aspiration to attain liberation cannot be that strong or firm.
Oh yeah. 근데 인도산에 따오 대성도 대신도 봐라. 대신도 청주된 얘기 다 로장인도산에 창축 세하게다 승리부터기 그 다가서다 되게 대소리지 말아. 창축사 창사 견제력하다 창신.
As to the second aspiration, the aspiration to attain full enlightenment. Again, here there is a direct relevance to one's understanding of emptiness, because the Tibetan word for enlightenment is changchup. In the Tibetan etymology of the two syllables, the first chang, which means purification or purified or having cleansed, and this refers to the quality of the fully enlightened Buddhas, which indicates that they have overcome all the negative characteristics and negative qualities. And the second syllable, chup, literally means having realized, and this suggests the quality of the Buddha for having perfected all the knowledge and realization. The etymology of the Tibetan word for enlightenment, changchup, suggests both qualities of overcoming negative aspects and perfection of the positive qualities.
Chalayada, Gumima Mingi Cabaret, any Yaji Chimpuchimbu Gedu Mado, Shen Shibu together, Hazore, the Mitumbe Cabarchimbu, some pageant mare. That Gedu that negative young Cabarchimbu Udua. That share with Chala. Any she won't do Cabaret, any Taiwan Namsha, Mendaudin, Song.
As far as the scriptures that outline the actual practice of training the mind is concerned, later Buddhist schools, particularly the mind-only school and the Madhyamaka, the middle way school, have developed an understanding that one must be able to distinguish within the scriptures of the Buddha two categories: those scriptures that can be taken at their literal face value and those which cannot be accepted as literal, but rather should be accepted as interpretive. In the final analysis, one has to return to one's own understanding and experience and reason. Application of one's critical thought and reason becomes very crucial. So it is because of this important point that the Buddha himself has said that, O bhikshus and wise people, do not accept something just because it has been said by me. By subjecting my words to such critical analysis and investigation, you must accept their validity, not because they have been spoken by me. So it is in this relation, there is also another motto for intelligent followers of the Buddha, which is that one should not rely on the person, but rather on the teachings. And even for the teachings, one should not rely simply on the basis of the words, but rather on the meaning. And even when taking the validity of the meaning, one should not rely on simply some intellectual understanding, but rather on deep realization. This is the intelligent way of approaching the Buddhist teachings. So I will leave at this point today, and what I'm suggesting to all of you is that you have to remain in this open skepticism that I spoke about.
And okay, finished. Yeah, that has just about doing that.
Like yesterday, we will do the preliminary recitations.
Sanje Jumden de Beja, Shaka Tuba, La Chansa, Lo Shudu, Josu, Dumbo, Jumden de Dijava, Jamba, Yanda was Rabada Joso, Daba, Dawra, Shava, Jide, Jamba, Jibun de Kalo Joa, Lana, Meva, Lada, Menam, Jedambasa. Beja, Shaka Tuba, La Chansa, Lo Shudu, Josu, Dumbo, Jumden de Dijava, Jamba, Yanda was Sanje, Rabada Joso. Ora Java Jiden Java Jivu De Kalo Java Lana Meba Lada Menam Jedam Baza Bejawa Shaka Duba La Chasa Lo Jado Jazo Je Gaze Ganye Zo Jedam Je Sajen De Lo Kombatum Mane Jiden De Na Joje Zon De Je Gava Jala Jaza Lo Nada Kuma Jodo Suzawa Ije Jazo Zeje Dumbura Chawa Jiden Zuna Lange Wa Kumbo Shoni Jala Jaz Sancha Daba Jimin Daveje Sanda Chawa Jala Jaza Lo De Jada Sipa Suma Ji Nyame Jinshin Jala Jaz Gombo Tushi Chandan Ba Tamshi Jenpe Dambo Bo Sunam Yende Jazo Jin Dishin Jala Jaza Lo Taben Desha Chawa Juru Keve Keso Chikdo Dada Shoju Ba Shiju Shala Jaza Lo Tene Teve Layante Lama Dala Rabdo Ne Shinge Damba Yende De Kintu Layate Tikpa Jiyan Bisha Jin Kyawa Pisun Sokpa Je Rangi Sene Yonsun Dun Dini Sanje Dapa Yin Karma Rari Marme Da Juma Sepo Melo Lada Jinda Bo Dishi Shana Dada Da Sanam Diye Damshe Sepo Ye Kopa Dane Junje Da Dede Kata Dada Shiru Sibe Solen Zho Zho Ra Zho 年对学我咱能更新你今也是正在看见的，让那办法像那那些你今现在都是在网上，看到样的那边都能那包困在那说的，年对像说300多件3000件的用得了长城路，看给电视这我中，各方面吧，见面吧，下班面吧，当面吧，我面吧，这面吧，他在对面对前面，这把你谢谢。 所谓三界万能界，唐巴的长城路。Good
morning to all of you.
Gyudon debu pusum sowa. Ani bigeda be chöyibe nyamnebe tartugoji da tagbe shinjibe chanjugo semsa di komya imbare. Da generebeni chanjugo semdi enda mitimbe gyule yungmare, gyumebale yungmare. tumbe gyule yonggu yare 대안이 말아서 로이니 교스니디 꼭 갈래 치는 교원들아지레 마도 루불이야베 교원들아스니디 즉 냠세암데 여다 여버리 저기 이네 디디 감감 규제 뭔구지 쏴스버지 타는 영야제 마도 가고 싶다래 저들이 민주산에 거라 림기 달로리아 이 교원들아지 고 인부 인도산에 금주 전주고 sem종사 될래야 그 림기 장과지 임버리
As we discussed yesterday, the highest form of spiritual practice is the cultivation of the altruistic intention to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, the cultivation of bodhicitta. And this is the precious, supreme state of mind, which is also the source of the benefit for the goodness of all temporary and ultimate aspirations. When it comes to the transformation of mind and hearts, it is something that cannot happen overnight. It has to happen through a gradual process. Although in some cases there may be possibility of kind of instantaneous spiritual kind of experiences here and there, but these are unreliable, so rather temporary. But the long-term spiritual transformation can really come through a gradual process of training and discipline. Of course, we find within the teachings of various ancient Indian spiritual traditions some kind of notion of nirvana or moksha or liberation or freedom, spiritual freedom. And also it seems that some other ancient Indian schools identify states of freedom or liberation with some kind of physical reality, physical plane or realm of existence. However, as far as the understanding of nirvana or spiritual freedom or liberation is concerned, according to Buddhism, that has to be understood in terms of a state of mind, and not in terms of some kind of external reality, but rather in terms of a state of mind.
That then page in the Taiwan in the Chinese Shayong page Jibu Mental Assembly. Chinese Daganda in any Nangbe Shung Kajineta, Benachama Devi in Dushi, that Dushitara, Dushita, Dushitata, because Jamiadi, you know, that Dushinane, Benjamin de Dajin Mozo Sanji Nigolia, any type you do the, any you won't be do.
Within the Buddhist schools, there is divergence of opinion as to what exactly is this liberation, what exactly is this liberation consist of, what is nirvana, and so on. For example, a school of Buddhism, a classical school of Buddhism known as Vaibhashika, maintains that the historical Buddha Shakyamuni was fully enlightened and had overcome 2 of the 4 negative forces, the afflictive emotions and thought, and also has overcome the powerful forces of desire and attachment. And he has not overcome the force of death, and he has not overcome the force of aggregate existence. According to this particular school, final nirvana is understood in terms of the total non-existence of the individual, total cessation of the individual. The implication is that when the final nirvana is attained, even the individual being ceases to exist. Now, of course, this is not accepted by many other Buddhist schools. For example, there is a very well-known objection by Nagarjuna, the philosopher, which asserts that if we were to take the understanding of nirvana according to the Vaibhashika school, then there will be the consequence that we will have to say that no one attains nirvana, no one, because when the final nirvana is attained, even the individual ceases to exist. So this implies that there is no one, there is nobody who attains nirvana, and this is ridiculous. We discussed yesterday, person or the individual is something that is designated upon the basis of the continuum of psychophysical aggregates, the existence of the mind and body complex. If the mind and body complex ceases to exist completely, then the individual also will cease to exist. And this is, however, not accepted by other Buddhist schools. So what we see here is that there is, even within the Buddhist school, kind of a diversity of opinion as to what exactly is this nirvana or liberation. And similarly, there are many aspects in the Vaibhashika school that are rejected by later Buddhist schools, other Buddhist schools, such as the Vaibhashika, for example, in the epistemological theory, Vaibhashikas reject any notion of sense data. Rather, they believe that the sensory perceptions occur as a result of mere interaction between the sense organs and the physical object. And there is no sense data which kind of acts as a medium, which is again rejected by other Buddhist schools. Similarly, in terms of understanding the nature of consciousness at the point of death, Vaibhashika has a much coarser understanding of that, whereas one of the objections raised against this epistemological concept of rejecting the sense datum by Vaibhashika is that, according to their theory, it would suggest that for any vivid perception of a particular object to occur, there needs to be a physical presence of the object in question. And this is, however, not the case. If we were to examine our own personal experience, we can observe that sometimes we can have very vivid recollection of objects as if it is really there in front of us. Quite a lot of ideas, Buddhist ideas of Vaibhashika school can be seen as sort of coarser, and other Buddhist schools have much more refined and subtler understanding of these issues. For one of the examples that Isolans gave was, according to Vaibhashika thought, the state of mind at the point of death could be virtuous, non-virtuous, or neutral. However, other Buddhist schools have argued that the actual state of mind at the actual moment of the death is always neutral, because it's a very subtle state of consciousness. So we can see that there is a kind of a much greater refinement in other schools of thought.
Now, any garaji the sibji any timin ding shawa timin. 자자가 the shawa 타고 지 전에 간다 any 마다웨라 가. 마다웨니 풍금 지식 취디다 고다 두 마다웨를 깨비 되잖아요. 대인이 봐 림베림베 봐 다루야 중그리디 이내 아니 자와지 다그 풍금 지식 취 영초도 가스 봐. 저들이 미리산에 변화되다
The later Buddhist schools argue that when through spiritual process and path one begins to perfect and purify the negative aspects of our mind and body, as the pollutants of mind cease to exist, their manifestations and their consequences and imprints, such as the impure body and mind, may cease to exist. But however, this does not mean that the very continuum of the individual ceases to exist. There will be a level of existence which is perfected, which is pure, and which is free of these pollutants. And this is explained in terms of what the Buddhist literature describes as existence in a mental body. So the point is that there is a lot of debate on this point about what exactly is the nature of liberation, enlightenment, and so on.
전에다 가다지 탈병모 탈동 쉐이르잖아요. 제가 받은 나와자베 이노 디 고든디 전도담인 담인 스쳐 전도담인 숨기야래. and that deep 자오시르고 공부다 디
From the Buddhist point of view, the nature of true liberation or spiritual freedom has to be understood in terms of a quality of mind, freedom from the various negative aspects and the pollutants. And we find that according to Chantakirti, a famous Madhyamaka, a thinker, the liberation or true cessation is said to be ultimate truth. And the point being made here is that understanding of the true cessation can only come about on the basis of an understanding of the ultimate nature of reality, in other words, emptiness, so that we see that it is the insight into emptiness, or it is the insight into ultimate nature of reality that allows the individual to eliminate the pollutants of the mind, and also it is the ignorance of this ultimate nature of reality that lies at the root of our obscuration and confusion and delusion. It is the emptiness of the mind at a perfected state, which is the true liberation. So what we find here is that the basis of true liberation is emptiness. The knowledge that by which we eliminate, we overcome the obscurations is also emptiness. And the final sort of perfected stage in which we attain such a liberation is also the emptiness of mind.
So当国定是的虚拟这个国定社会的因为开不了的路不为什么的年不到的证呢？哎你路不那么大的原点点点的这个人性的那把他把对他了，帮着看有人问是年不证呢
？True cessation or liberation is a quality that has two dimensions. One is its total freedom from the pollutants, and one is it is the total negation of the inherent existence, self-existence. For example, we find in the first verse of Nagarjuna's Fundamentals of the Middle Way, when he pays homage to the Buddha, and he does so by saying that Buddha have taught the principle of dependent origination and emptiness. And there he describes true cessation in terms of the total pacification of all what he calls elaborations, conceptual elaborations. And it is when all the conceptual elaborations have been calmed and have been pacified, that's the true cessation. Compassion is that wish which spontaneously aspires all sentient beings to be free of suffering. And so compassion is said to be at the root of all altruistic activity and at the root of the altruistic intention. And so what is required is the cultivation of compassion that is powerful enough, what the Buddhists call great compassion, that is powerful enough to lead to a sense of responsibility, that the individual practitioner feels truly compassionate so that he or she feels committed to bringing about the well-being by the sentient beings. He or she feels committed enough to shoulder upon himself or herself the responsibility to make this happen. So what is required here is that kind of powerful compassion. And we find, if we look at the Mahayana Buddhist literature, we find this point repeatedly emphasized, the fact that compassion, the great compassion, is the foundation of all positive qualities. Great compassion is the root of all spiritual, Mahayana spiritual path. And great compassion is the root of bodhicitta. Maitreya says in his Sutra Alamkara, the ornament of sutras, he says that compassion is the root of bodhicitta. Compassion is the root of altruistic intention. And similarly, we find Chantakirti saying in his Guide to the Middle Way, compassion is such a high spiritual quality that maintains its relevance throughout all times. At the initial stage of a spiritual path, it is equally relevant and important while on the path, and it is also equally valid and relevant even when the individual has become full enlightenment. So what the point I'm trying to make is that if we look at any Mahayana literature, we will find that compassion is not only highly extolled, but also repeatedly emphasize its importance and how compassion really lies at the root of all spiritual endeavor. So generally when we talk about compassion, compassion is an aspiration that wishes others to be, that object of your compassion to be free of suffering. But if we look carefully, there could be two levels of compassion or two degrees of compassion. In one case, the emotion may be simply at the level of wish, just wishing the other to be, that object of compassion, to be free of suffering. But there could be a higher level of compassion where the emotion goes beyond the simple wish, and there is an added dimension of wanting to do something, and a sense of responsibility, a sense of commitment enters into your thought and emotion. So there, one can say that there are two degrees of compassion. However, a successful development and cultivation of compassion really requires the complementary factor of wisdom and insight, because if you lack the faculty of wisdom and insight, then when you are confronted with an object of suffering, you may feel this kind of genuine compassion, kind of spontaneously. But given that your resources are limited, you may simply kind of have the wish, thinking, may he or she be free of that pain or suffering. But slowly that kind of feeling may kind of lead into some kind of helplessness, because immediately you realize, well, I can't do anything. Whereas if you are equipped with the faculty of wisdom and insight, then you have a much greater resources to draw from, so that your compassion, the more you focus on that object of compassion, the greater the intensity of your compassion will be, the greater it will increase.
Today, this is a shirugi, that Kawak thing, any young Injilia, any shirugi, talk, mixake Mavachenta, Mavasla was all that could do the Ninja to Zane, any got some just down maybe Ninjas there, chick. That's a thing only a shiru, mixage but sad of them.
In Buddhist literature, we find discussions of 3 different types of compassion, or 3 different levels of compassion. One is the initial stage of compassion, where your compassion is simply the wish to see other sentient beings free from suffering. It is not complemented by it is not reinforced by any particular insight into the nature of suffering, nor the nature of that sentient being. Then there is the second level of development of compassion, where your compassion towards other sentient beings is not simply a wish to see that sentient being free from suffering, but also it is reinforced by such insights into the impermanent nature, the transient nature of the existence. So since we define compassion as that wish, that emotion that wishes to see the other being free of suffering, so what is required is the ability to feel connected to that being. We also see that the more we feel close towards a particular person or animal or whatever it is, the greater our capacity to empathize with that being. And therefore, one of the elements in the spiritual practice of developing compassion and cultivating compassion is to try to develop this ability to feel empathetic, this ability to feel connected and sense of closeness to others. And in Buddhist literature, this is described as a sense of intimacy with the object of compassion. It is described as loving kindness, but it really refers to a sense of connectedness, sense of closeness, so that the greater the sense of closeness you feel towards the being, the greater the force of your sense of being unable to bear the sight of that individual suffering, because it is suffering that we wish others to be free of. Therefore, the other element of the practice of compassion is to develop some deeper understanding of the nature of suffering. So as for techniques of cultivating this sense of closeness or intimacy towards others, which is a key element of the practice of compassion, we find in the traditional Buddhist literature 2 principal methods. One, although stemming from Nagarjuna, but more fully developed and presented by Shantideva in his Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, is the technique known as exchanging and equalizing self with others. And the other technique is the technique known as the 7-point cause and effect method, where the principal emphasis is placed on trying to cultivate a thought, an attitude that would allow you to, that would enable you to relate to all the other sentient beings as someone very dear to you.
Stand the Lojong London City, so Daxin is no Lojan, the Sungiare. Ready in a signal, my net $7 number shows, Soyandavo, Tigitaka, Simjet Hadalola, any Matabu, Jeshin Pangala Brigada, Diagi, Kandata, Marshive, Sigtanudua, Zizaneta Kanda, Dini Sunjig Tane, Yamni Dayaji.
So depending upon the individual's mental disposition, inclinations and mentality and so on, it seems that for some, the techniques presented within the method of 7-point cause and effect seem to be more effective. For some, the technique of exchanging and equalizing self with others seem to be more effective. However, within the Tibetan tradition, the custom really has been to try to engage in a practice where there is a combination of both these methods, both these traditions. In this text, 8 verses on training the mind, although the principal approach seemed to be that of exchanging and equalizing self with others, but we do find references to all other sentient beings as mother sentient beings.
Manga yudu dumego no lo jang yudu zane, ene thoma ene sim nyoba tukre, tangyum. Di tangyum di, ene ji bu so so da, ji nyen yudu tabuli ya, chakbe sim ji loda nyor.
The first stage of that practice is to try to cultivate a sense of equanimity towards all sentient beings, an ability to relate to all others equally. And what is required here is to try to address the problems of having fluctuating thoughts and emotion towards other sentient beings. And here, not only should we try to overcome sort of extreme negative emotions like anger and hatred towards others, but also here in this particular spiritual practice, one should also try to address the attachment that one feels towards one's loved ones. Of course, in this sense of closeness that we feel towards our loved ones, there is an intimacy, there is an element of love and compassion, but often these affections and these emotions are really tinged with attachment. That kind of feeling towards that individual person is very susceptible to extreme emotions. When such a person does something that is beyond our expectations or against our expectations or contrary to our expectations, it has a much greater potential to hurt us. So in this context of this particular spiritual practice, we're also trying to level that out so that our sense of closeness towards others are genuine and they are not tinged with attachment or desire. The key point that we are trying to achieve in this practice of developing equanimity as a first stage is to try to overcome feelings of partiality and discrimination that we normally and naturally feel towards others. And also it seems to be true that attachment has a limiting effect on your vision. Attachment constrains your vision so that you are not able to see from the wider perspective. And this really seems to be true. Recently I was at a seminar on science and religion in Argentina, and one of the participant scientists, he's the mentor of a well-known neurobiologist called Francisco Varela. The scientist made a point that even for professional scientists, it is very important to adopt as a methodological principle that when they engage in their research, that they are not emotionally attached to their subject of inquiry, because attachment has the negative effect of clouding your vision and narrowing your vision, and which I totally agree. What we are trying to achieve in this practice of equanimity is to overcome these feelings of partiality and these feelings of fluctuating thoughts and emotion so that we can deal with all others, relate to all others with even-handedness. I would also like to express my appreciation of the general Western emphasis on objectivity. There's a constant emphasis on the need for objectivity. However, I do also detect a major contradiction, because when you talk to people from various professions, particularly from the Western, in the Western countries, there seems to be a tremendous amount of kind of attachment to their own profession, tremendous amount of, one could say, investment of identification, so much so that they feel as if this profession is so vital, almost indispensable, and for the world's kind of well-being, that if this profession becomes degenerate, the whole world will suffer. There seems to be that kind of attitude. This really suggests that there is a more than appropriate level of attachment, and this is Tsongkhapa, the great Tibetan thinker, has once said that sometimes people have a tendency to pick up one piece of grain, and then making an observation on this, and then saying that all the grains in the whole universe is just like this. So there seems to be that kind of total attachment to one's own narrow perspectives.
Objectively,
So there seems to be a contradiction between these two kind of aspects of the Western psyche.
Any physically, yeah, make set them the chene, Pandayari. She was in Dunia, Dada, Yen, the Parmesan, Jensum, Lolia, Dunia set up.
So in this practice of developing equanimity towards all, sometimes it is helpful to do some visualizations. For example, one can imagine in front of you 3 different individuals, someone who is close to you, someone whom you feel great intimacy and closeness and attachment, and someone whom you regard as being your enemy, someone that you dislike, and then take someone in the middle who's completely neutral towards you, towards whom you feel indifference. And then once you have visualized these 3 individuals in front of you, and then kind of let your natural emotions and thoughts arise in you, how you relate to these 3 different individuals. And once you are able to allow your natural feelings to arise, then you will notice that towards loved ones, you will feel a sense of closeness and also a great attachment. And then towards the individual that you dislike, of course, there will be a feeling of dislike, maybe even hostility, and of course, there's a feeling of distance. And then towards the individual who is neutral, then there will be hardly any feeling of emotion. There will be total indifference. And then try to reason, why do I feel such fluctuating emotions towards these 3 different individuals? Why do I feel so attached to the loved ones? And then you might begin to see that there are certain grounds that such a person is dear to you, such a person has done this and that to you, such a person is related to me in those ways. But if you then ask yourself, are these characteristics permanent? That is not necessarily the case. A friend may be a friend today and not at some other time. And especially from a Buddhist point of view, when we take into account the framework of many lifetimes, then the individual who may be very close to you in this life may have been your enemy in some other life, and may have done some really bad things towards you. So there is no real grounds for feeling that extremely attached, that extreme kind of emotion. And then similarly, when you turn your attention towards someone that you dislike, and you examine, on what grounds do I feel such negative emotions towards that person? So there is a kind of a temporality to the quality of being enemy. So you begin to see that there is no real grounds, justifiable grounds for having such extreme hatred or negativity towards that person. And then you look at the individual in the middle, you may feel totally indifferent, but then, if you begin to examine and raise the same kind of questions, that individual may have been hardly any relevance to your life in this life, but may have been a very important part of life in some other lives in the past, or even in this lifetime. That individual may become someone important in your life at some point. So then you begin to, when you do this kind of visualization, then it helps you to really level out the extreme fluctuating emotions that you feel towards others, and then kind of establish a kind of a stable basis to build a more healthy sense of closeness.
진설식 송디 년부도와 당념 서시 참배 출린신 닝지사비 균제 매발레 장심 준신 조배 장심 준신 조바 스소.
So Gyaltsab Rinpoche has given a wonderful imagery or analogy. He compares the equanimity as a level ground, a fertile soil. So once you have laid out the field, then you can plant the seed of compassion. Sorry, and then and you water that soil with the moisture of love, and then plant the seed. And when you plant the seed of compassion continuously and nurture it, and then the shoot of bodhicitta, the altruistic intention, will naturally grow. So that's a beautiful imagery.
those samdana, those samdana, and those samdana, as it when there is some of it. I think when it touch to touch the time, that recommend that Lambarisha, some do something to.
So when you think along these lines from various angles, then you will begin to feel that perhaps the extreme fluctuating emotions that we tend to feel towards others, that we tend to relate to others in those terms, is perhaps unwise.
Teneda, mat me chambe, nyandu tubia, that dibare. That tell any, she sold in Gyawa Tomameva. Any, Nagi Tomameva. The next time, some Dani, any, Matzor Tibet, Nyandu Moju Yamaris, Dustukiari.
And then the second stage, after having developed this equanimity towards all, then the second stage is then the cultivation of a thought of relating to all others as someone who is very dear to you, someone close to you, like a mother or like a father or like a friend. And here, of course, the teachings take into account the idea of beginningless lifetimes. So all other sentient beings have been at one point of their lives been our mother or been our father or a close friend and so on. So it is through this way you relate to others and try to develop a sense of closeness.
And to do negri, the mati, but to do the Kashapana, Padinium Dolia, Kunyamnish,
the reason why in the traditional literature there is tremendous emphasis placed on viewing all other sentient beings as mother is that the fact is, in the natural world, when it comes to the nurturing and bringing up of an offspring, it is predominantly the mother who plays a critical role. We can see that even in the animal realm, although there are exceptions where the father also plays a critical role. For example, there are some species of birds where the mother hardly participates in the building of the nest, and it's the father, the male bird, that really works hard and builds the nest, and often the female bird is just watching and inspecting, and which does seem to be quite appropriate and fair that the male takes a greater responsibility in the nurturing. But however, that's not the case. So generally, it is the mother that really plays a critical role in nurturing their offsprings. If we look at the example of butterflies, the butterflies lay their egg. There is no possibility that the mother is ever going to really meet the offspring when the caterpillars come out. But even then, the mother makes sure that the egg is laid in a very secure area, where there is food, where there is a protection. Of course, we cannot say that such animals have compassion in the sense that we understand, but whatever it may be the reason, whether it is biology or whether it is some chemical processes or whether they have compassion or whatever be the reason, the fact remains that the mother goes to such great length to ensure the safety and the nurturing of their offsprings. So it is for these reasons that in the traditional literature, in the Tibetan and Indian text, the mother is singled out as a kind of an example of relating to other sentient beings.
mother-centered beings.
And also, in fact, in the Tibetan language, the term, an expression is coined referring to all other sentient beings as mother-sentient beings.
Male the female right qualification is so much as mother father so module subject has sick the assembly
And in fact, in the Tibetan, the expression, this mother-sentient beings has become so deeply embedded in people's kind of, one can call imprinted in their psyche, that it is, and it has a kind of a poetic ring to it. So when sometimes when people talk about sort of raised gender issues in the context of Tibetan culture, and I tell them that, for me, this whole idea and the expression that goes with it, this mother-sentient beings, is a really great example of how the value of mother has been recognized in the Tibetan culture. And in fact,
Tibetan culture or Buddhist culture.
In the Buddhist culture. In fact, such that this very expression, mother-sentient beings, seems to have a kind of a powerful kind of force to evoke something in you. Whereas if you try to do the same thing to the father, say father-sentient beings, somehow it doesn't seem right. It doesn't sound right.
And the person now, Parkans learn the tricky job. The party marathon should do what the Parkan Tesla.
And in fact, the Tibetan expression, Magen Simjen Tamje, which means the dear mother-sentient beings, and it has a kind of a poetic and also rather sentimental, emotive ring to it. Whereas if you try to do the same thing with the male pronoun, Pagen Simjen Tamje, the dear father-sentient beings. In fact, this expression, dear father, has a rather pejorative connotation of someone who is rather kind of naughty and irresponsible and
Ta marshi tubya le the kyawa thungmi tubya ani tela rigya thungmi tubya sene yingyo ta de tangya da choshu tubya de rigba sa ti ngocho kwa de ta da luri shi sum rigba da zojing rigba ma da sem de rigba yawa chebe kudu rigba.
So in the traditional literature there is an understanding that this kind of profound recognition of all other sentient beings as your mother is really based upon the existence of multiple lifetimes. According to the Buddhist teachings, the great emphasis is placed on having some kind of understanding of the possibility of pre-existence or rebirth on the basis of understanding the nature of consciousness. The point is made that consciousness is a phenomenon which comes into being only due to a previous moment of consciousness. Matter cannot become conscious. In terms of material continuum, in terms of the substantial continuum, consciousness must have a preceding moment of consciousness. And of course, when we talk about consciousness, everybody talks about consciousness, everybody talks about mind, thoughts, emotions, and so on. And in the Buddhist literature, consciousness is defined as that which is in the nature of mere luminosity and knowing. It is that quality, that faculty of knowing and awareness. But of course we talk about these things, but I personally feel that a real understanding of what we mean by mind or what we mean by consciousness can only come about on the basis of some kind of experience. I don't think intellectual discussion alone or intellectual kind of description, verbal description alone really convey the sense of what is meant by consciousness or mind.
The Delia, any Zogjingi, any Benazita, she could be yamling down to Zane, and a yell headway, the headway tane, any Ribosande, Shine Chita, Mochoka, and Chita, we give in Zane, some heady jot of a detail, any Nyonsam, Rixamgi, Chick Nyanji, Kalegalia, Lol Shaji, Yongsare. 다가는 신기보나 사제 사동 송주 송유 되잖아요. 아니 사와 셈기 생이 송유 되잖아요. 뒤에 거라 셈 소마 마죄베 아니 랑신로 고도 젠발 냥수녀야 그냥 냠용 깨고야. 그 정도가 다가는 신기 자들이 메디선에 다 늦은 냠는 거 타네. 지 시리 지다 냐지 리부지 사즈 리그섬 그 ᱧ어 차야래. 띠딴데 판도 요사래.
So I feel that it is, it is very useful to have some kind of experiential sense of what is meant by this faculty of mere luminosity and knowing that we call consciousness or that we call mind. There are, no.
겐댕이 있는 창생 나라리야. 아니 그 셈이 신이 공부해 있잖아요. 그 최생에는 셈이 무슨 소리잖아요. 다 간다이니 거기 사지 셔부 있는다. 지다 길루 사지 셔부 있는다. 간다이니 간다 셈이 무슨 거와 봐. 최생이 무슨 거와 봐. 저리잖아요. 그 뒤최생 무슨 소리야 되는 그 믹스이야. 그게 ቋ 때문에 유리잖아요. 아니 신의 그 최생 시리 사즈 직접 녀에 되는 게 최디 신의 아니 녀도는 못 쳐야지 용도가. 저단디 디천에다 리보 못 쳐야잖아요. 에노 리비아도 두 번에 말이야. 아니 리보이 미쳐진 댄지 거 있잖아요. 댄댄은 누구지? 타연사래. 되면은 가오래.
So we find in the Tibetan tradition different techniques that sort of assist us in developing this experiential sense of what is meant by consciousness or awareness. For example, in the Dzogchen tradition, there is a practice of observing the nature of mind, beginning with a sense of wonderment, and then allowing your thoughts to arise. On that kind of neutral state of mind, then you observe the activity of mind. Similarly, in the Sakya tradition of the union of what they call the profound and clarity, there is also a technique for observing the nature of mind on the basis of allowing the mind to rest in its natural state, natural uncontrived state, and then observing its activity. Similarly, we find in the Gelug and Kagyu traditions, in their practices of Mahamudra, the Great Seal path, there is again techniques for identifying what is meant by mind or consciousness or awareness. So, it is, once you engage in these practices, and as a result, if you have some experiential sense of what is meant by awareness, then when you try to understand the beginningless continuum of consciousness or awareness, then it will begin to make sense. But otherwise, to simply say that every instance of awareness must have a preceding instance because it is an instance of awareness, that alone it really cannot be that convincing. But if you have some kind of experiential base of what awareness really is, and then you will be able to have a greater appreciation of the beginningless continuum of awareness.
다 되네 진짜 봐. 다 맞다 우르규베 거두겠다. 진기 경주디를 사발해.
And then the third element in the 7-point cause and effect method, we have dealt with equanimity, we have dealt with the recognition of all other sentient beings as mother, and the third one is reflecting upon their kindness.
And 진야고 sometimes 어찌 더 차오. 근데 진진디 네 야원도 저기 말에 삼바지 로래야. 다 여러분 저 봐주야. 여러분 삼도 주야나 근데 로디 정숙레임도 와. 진삼이자 어찌 삼바지.
So when you, in your meditation, begin to reflect upon the kindness of all other sentient beings, especially when they have been your mother in one or other lifetimes, then when you kind of focus on this, then of course it will lead to the thought that I must repay their kindness, I must acknowledge this profound kindness to me, and such kind of feelings will arise naturally to someone who is conscientious, someone who is ethical, and someone who is kind of one could call civilized.
대단한 진진기 마겐 셈젠 사지로리아 샤유드잖아요. 아니 제시방을 나발로 샤고.
So once you begin to have this thought, the recognition of all other sentient beings as kind, dear mothers, then of course, naturally, you will have a feeling of intimacy and feeling of closeness to others.
Any 대땡라 any 대화도 단독이 참바다 동네도 단독이 닝신이부터 이 장이 뭐야.
So on the basis of that, then you should cultivate love, which in the Tibetan, in the traditional Buddhist literature, is defined as the wish to see others enjoy happiness. That is called loving kindness. And then you develop also compassion, that is the wish that aspires others to be free of suffering. So they are two sides of the same thing.
야. 다전에 당신부터는 로장이다.
So as far as the technique for cultivating, training your mind according to the exchanging and equalizing self with others is concerned,
다양 도마 땅용 거 직시해.
again for this, the first stage is the cultivation of equanimity.
이는 네 땅용 공부때 탐제 동에 면도받아 대완도봐. 곧 탐제는 랑도 수보이 무준세도 쳐야 탐제니 가서 우리 그게 다 가서 우리 그게 대완도념 찍도다 냠치 다지 두고요.
However, the equanimity, the sense of the meaning of equanimity in this context is different from the one which we spoke about earlier. Here, equanimity has to be understood more in terms of equality, fundamental equality of all, in the sense that just as you yourself have the natural wish and spontaneous wish to be happy and overcome suffering, so do all others equally. So one tries to cultivate the thought of equality, fundamental equality, the basic equality of all living beings in the fact that we all wish to be happy and we all wish to avoid suffering.
단 대응도 잡아시잖아. 아니 나라 아니 동네에 타나 사바지다. 대화지 톰나 삼베 로텔라. 아니 정신다 대화 대바다 동네 면도바 대균들이.
Now, if we try to probe a bit deeper and try to understand the implications of these basic aspirations that we all have as individuals to be free of suffering and enjoy happiness, the aspirations do not arise within us on the basis of some kind of considerations of that I am very important to myself, or that that I have been kind to myself. Such considerations simply do not play any role. These basic aspirations arise in us simply by virtue of that we are individual living beings. And that's by the simple fact that we are a conscious living being is the ground on which this basic aspiration to be happy and overcome suffering arises.
다다 셴 니리야 저하게 매버치지 소소소소 다 가다지 마음변이 사장로 소소소 갑자로 dob장로씩 셴세디 갑자로 dob장로씩 이메이나 야네도 가가 대마이 시kwa를 내면 네글리니 조sem전에 때네 소국도 람라레베 네글리니 조sem전 미유드체네 아니 잠지 자주 셈자야 진속 그게다 잡아라려야 시sem전 땡샤 sem전을 하려샤 대부산 견내장 칠레 고밤에 봤어야지 칠레 죽세 유래 때는 조국도 근데 이 메이드잖아 시람 대부 강근 네글리니 다다 셴세야지 배탈 제도가.
Now, if self and others are totally independent of each other, if there is no connection whatsoever between self and others, then perhaps there is a case for ignoring the well-being of others and simply pursuing one's own self-interest and being totally oblivious to others. But this is, however, not the case. Self and others are not really completely independent. And in fact, the interest of self and others are in some sense intertwined. Now, especially from the Buddhist point of view, right from the beginning on the spiritual path, almost every aspect of spiritual practices, from the Buddhist point of view, even when you remain in samsaric existence, the unenlightened existence as an ordinary being, even in that samsaric existence, your life is so intertwined with those of others that you cannot really completely carve out yourself as a single individual that is unrelated to others. And also, when you are engaging in a spiritual path, many of the spiritual realization and progress really depends upon your interaction with others. So others are indispensable. Similarly, from the Buddhist point of view, even when you have attained highest enlightenment, the enlightened activities are for the benefit of others. Enlightened activities come into being spontaneously because they are other sentient beings. So others are indispensable. So your life and others' lives are so intertwined that the idea of self as totally distinct and self as totally independent of others really does not make any sense.
대단하야. 그 답할이야. 라제버즈 진진데 아니 수학 닝부도 붙이는 아주 심대로 봐. 대단념돌이야. 아니 다도 준비 된진디게 아니 뿡지체. 다도 닝비 으라 다 장체. 안 뒤장ben 레불이야. 그득 들어와. 동네서 담아 봐. 놈은 뒤는 마셔서 깨들어와.
So, although this is the reality, this intertwining nature of self and others' interest and self and others' existence, this is not reflected in our behavior. Up to now, we have, regardless of whatever the reality, we have nurtured within ourselves the self-cherishing thought, something that we hold very dear and we almost regard it as precious, something like a core in us. And this is accompanied by another powerful thought in us, which is the belief in some kind of real existence, true existence of oneself as a kind of a being. So these two thoughts, the beliefs that there is a real I, there is a real self, there is a kind of a substantially real self, and also this kind of attachment, this cherishing of one's own interest at the expense of others, oblivious to others. These are the kind of two principal thoughts and emotions which we have nurtured within us throughout our many lives. And but what is the result of this? What is the benefit of this? We are continually suffering. We are continually experiencing fluctuating negative thoughts and emotions. So this hasn't really gotten us far.
시간이 좀 있다비네. 전부지 되가라. 말아서 답에 영자 다시 짬미시 버듯이 도지 되버 때 탐자로 야옥도 세잖아. 샘모도에 타는 영도 세브샤네. 샘모도에 자와디 라제브즈 비진진다. 아니 다도즈 비 덴진이부 되게 배 가서 뽕단 제니. 아니 영도에 탐자로 세셔버다 세브샤네.
So, and also if we try to sort of shift our focus from self to others, to the wider world, and when we observe all the kind of crises in the world, all the difficulties, all the sufferings, and so on, we will see that many of the problems, many of the crises really are consequences, either directly or indirectly, of an undisciplined state of mind, negative states of mind and thoughts and emotions. And where do these come from? They come from this powerful joining of forces between this self-centeredness and also this belief in some kind of independent self, independently existing self. So even when we shift our focus on the wider world, we will also begin to appreciate the negativity, the destructive consequences of the harboring these kind of thoughts. Recently, I was at a medical conference in America, and one of the participating scientists, a psychologist, presented the findings of his study. One conclusion that he has reached, which is almost indisputable, is that there seems to be a correlation between early death and also high levels of blood pressure and heart-related diseases among people. And this was a study done on men. Among men who tends to use disproportionately high number of first personal pronouns, I, me, and mine, which suggests having kind of very strong attachment to oneself, and which I thought was very interesting. And in fact, it should be the case. I have recently heard a new kind of Tibetan expression that someone has coined an expression called I, the precious one. Although it sort of sounds strange, but it is, I think, if you think carefully, it is quite an interesting expression. So even the medical studies, the scientific studies suggest that there is a correlation between too much or excessive self-cherishing and physical health. Now, these are the consequences of harboring or grasping onto self-centeredness. Now, in contrast, if you shift your focus from self onto others, extend towards others, and develop more thoughts cherishing the well-being of other sentient beings, then it will have the immediate effect of kind of opening up and reaching out. In other words, cultivation of altruism really has a beneficial effect, not only from the religious Buddhist point of view in the long term of spiritual development, but even from a kind of a mundane point of view, from my own personal experience. I can tell you that when I practice altruism, when I think about a sense of caring for others, it immediately has an effect within me that makes me calmer and also more secure. We can immediately begin to see its positive effects. Similarly, when you cultivate the thought, the understanding that self is not really independently existing entity, rather, when you begin to view self in terms of dependent origination, dependent in relation to others, then although it is difficult to say that one may gain profound spiritual realization, but at least even the simple reflection on the dependent nature of reality of self and others begin to have an effect. You begin to think, that's interesting. Something interesting begins to happen within you. So you can see that even in the immediate terms, there is definitely a positive beneficial effect in reversing the two attitudes, from self-centeredness to other-centeredness, and from belief in self-existence to belief in dependent origination. There is an effect.
저장아 된뒤네니 시월에 지된 대화 진입 대군 셴든 늘려줘. 지된 동에 진입 대군 딱든 늘려줘서 다른 거네래셔. 엔디 domde 망도 셔도 지시고 집어랑 그 된지도 투버신기 된저버 니기니 캬버도 신수야들이셔.
So to summarize all of this discussion, I think Shantideva is very right. He says that, what more do I need to say about the virtues of cherishing the well-being of others? What more do I need to say about the negative consequences, shortcomings of self-centeredness? Just compare the fate of ordinary sentient beings who still cling on to self-centeredness and what state they are in, and the fully enlightened beings who have reversed this attitude and have established or cultivated other-centeredness. So, there's nothing more to say. Simply compare the two. Therefore, one could say that the source of all misery in the world lies in self-centeredness, and the source of all happiness and goodness in the world lies in other-centeredness.
다 되게 가서 당신냥 봐. 다지 고도문을 삼아. 현재의 고도문을 삼아서 다 님부터 주시오.
So, these are then first the cultivation of equanimity, and then recognition of the negative consequences of self-cherishing attitude, and then recognition of the positive effects of other-centeredness.
다 당신이 없이 계신 분들은 그냥 소소 클래스에 계셔도 와.
Of course, exchanging and equalizing of self and others is very important, but more important is that you have to feed yourself.
Thank you. 가나다가 팬다고 러시아와 것이 시도면 내는 신인 담바 따오셔. 난디 소소를 내지들 개신인을 따고 그래서 다 준중나 10 차고야.
And then the next verse reads that not only should one be tolerant towards these individuals, but in fact one should view them as teachers. One should view them as spiritual teachers. It reads that when one whom I have benefited with great hope unreasonably hurts me very badly, I will learn to view that person as an excellent spiritual guide. And there is an extensive discussion of how this kind of attitude could be cultivated in Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, how, in fact, one can view the perpetrators of harm upon oneself as objects of sort of spiritual learning.
다른 식의 세ven 냠링 꼴이 우문주게 디 갈고디 심지숨바 말베 심지숨베 나로가 할레버리샤.
And also we find profoundly inspiring and effective teachings on the cultivation of patience and tolerance in the third chapter of Chantakirti's supplement to the Middle Way, Madhyamaka Avatara. So we will read some questions now. Your Holiness, I want so much to be a better, kinder human being, to be compassionate and to get rid of all my negative thoughts and actions. But the harder I try to work towards this, the more mistakes I make, the more I seem to sleep. It feels like walking through sludge.
As I explained, the transformation of mind not easy, take time. So should not lose courage and interest. You should continue. Even, you see, I think helpful is to think not only just as a few weeks or a few months or a few years, life after life, and 1,000 lives, million lives, trillion lives, eons, limitless eons. That's the Buddhist way of thinking. So as I mentioned earlier, to me, when I, you see, feel certain sort of, some frustrations, or some too much sadness, then I remember the shloka, as long as space remains, as long as sentient beings, sufferings remain, I will remain in order to serve them. So remind us that and repeat that verses and think, meditate on it immediately. Sort of the mental sort of frustrations or these things immediately disappear. So you see, the more sort of determination, irrespective of what time, that kind of determination develop, the things become much easier. The more you see you want immediately something, then things become more difficult. So that's my experience, my own experience. If you find something useful, then think like that. If you find no meaning, then I don't know. I have no idea, advice.
The anger I feel sometimes has its basis in fear. When I get angry, I feel more powerful, then I'm not afraid anymore. How should I deal with that?
That's very true. We all have same experience. So that you see, you feel some kind of courage or more power, but that actually blind power. That energy may not be constructive or destructive, not very sure. More anger eventually may take one's own life. So foolish. If you have, I think, a sort of clear sort of awareness, the negativeness or harmfulness about anger, then think more that sort of, I think, the viewpoint. And then on the other hand, again,
it also depends upon the object of anger.
미르비치를 미네 콘도사비 있느니 야 미디기 연대한 사람다 핑크와.
For example, if your anger is directed towards an individual person, then you can think about some of the positive qualities of that person which can have the effect of reducing your anger.
양지 동네르지로 사람 과체. 아니 저 강도 세비는 다 좀제도 예배서지.
But on the other hand, if your anger is as a result of some painful experiences that you have undergone, then
or the world affair is some certain things
Crisis,
which good
some
crisis.
world crisis or something, then of course there is some justifiable ground for your anger.
이네들이 판단됩니다. 루나니.
But however, if one thinks through carefully, there is no real benefit for getting angry.
Yeah.
When Your Holiness talk about control of emotions, that can in the West sometimes mean a repression of emotions, suppression of emotions. How do we approach this practice with the lightness of mind?
들어봐. 지 동네로 사직 중대지기. 디견전의 삼례야 뭐지비사 여대비식 임베는 그래도 또한샤나 나도 배배벨레 동나서 표현이 상스러는 시체.
Of course, it's very true that sometimes suppression can be actually negative, particularly if the frustration or the resentment or anger is experienced as a result of some painful experience that one has undergone in the past. Suppressing that anger can be negative and destructive. So under such circumstances, expression of that emotion can be free. There is a Tibetan expression which says that if there's a problem of conch being blocked, the way you can solve the problem is just blowing it out so that it's unblocked. So there is that understanding that certain forms of emotions which are particularly directed towards past experiences of painful kind, they are better expressed. But on the other hand, if you have a clear recognition of their destructive potential, you can begin to distance yourself from such explosive outbursts so that gradually you will diminish their forces. Why are positive thoughts and emotions to be preferred and encouraged above negative ones? Are they not equally impermanent and lacking in independent existence?
맞다. 집에 다니 집거래디 개별 레벨로 뒤용도와. 레벨에 집에는 시래 교회 집에는 시래디 만저 대화디 집에는 시래 동해디 집에는 시래 나도 대화 되고도가.
Although both of them are equally devoid of inherent existence, fact remains that negative thoughts and emotions lead to suffering and painful experiences, whereas positive thoughts and emotion leads to happiness. And what we seek, what we all wish to achieve is happiness.
And pain also momentarily changing. Same. If you use that logic, there's no need to seek happiness. And no need to make effort to overcome suffering. Both momentarily changing. Just lay down. Just wait. I think that's not, I think, a proper way. So therefore, they deliberately, you see, those source or cause of happiness, try to seek, try to implement. So those sources and causes of suffering is deliberately try to overcome, try to stop. Okay, I don't know. Even Buddhahood, also momentarily changing. Everything momentarily changing. Good night. Thank you.
Seriously. So a true understanding of the middle way philosophy of emptiness can only arise if one can distinguish between negation of intrinsic existence and identity and rejection of existence, per se, existing says total nothingness. So one has to be able to respond to the criticism of the mind-only school, and at the same time defend the Madhyamaka rejection of intrinsic being without falling into a position of rejecting existing at all.
배제 자시를 그럽지 니두고디메다. 니고라 11 14다.
So in Nagarjuna's writings, I think it's the 26th chapter of his Fundamentals on the Middle Way, where he takes great pain. He takes great pain to defend the Madhyamaka rejection of intrinsic existence on the grounds that it is not nihilistic. That there is a difference between total nothingness, rejection of existence, and rejection of intrinsic existence.
Oh yeah. 다시 추주 또 심슬라 다시 하게면도 땅은 심지디 아니 양라든바 고야매 그체 세문나로야 샤와체 엔드네 이 차숨 자즈마 송수아
So with that, the teachings,
세문나로야 나고 이버디디 아니 뒤에 식신의 신신이 고마야오지 시 아니 야지 나고 맹엔 출루 현다 이버즈에 지금들 지 샴페인으로 아니 소소식다 그다지 템베 럽지디야 템베 타는 샴페인으로 야고 봤어야도는 지거리 에 미세셜 도나 맹엔 지베네다 샴페인으로 또 상다는 디버와 독신다.
So with that, the actual teachings on the transforming the mind and the 8 verses on training the mind is complete, and we will now do the generation of the mind for enlightenment. And amongst the members of the audience, those who consider themselves as practicing Buddhists, you should all recite these verses together. And as you do the recitation, you should reflect upon the meanings of the words and try to reinforce and enhance your own development of altruism and compassion that we spoke about over the last few days. And those who are practitioners of other religious traditions, you can use this opportunity to really draw from one's own spiritual teachings and try to commit oneself to the cultivation of altruistic thoughts, and also try to enhance one's commitment to the altruistic ideals. And now we will read these verses together. It's on page 15. We'll read this 3 times. With a wish to free all beings, I shall always go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, until I reach full enlightenment. Enthused by wisdom and compassion, today in the Buddha's presence, I generate the mind for full awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. As long as space endures, as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain and dispel the miseries of the world. With a wish to free all beings, I shall always go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, until I reach full enlightenment. Enthused by wisdom and compassion, today in the Buddha's presence, I generate the mind for full awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. As long as space endures, as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain and dispel the miseries of the world. With a wish to free all beings, I shall always go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, until I reach full enlightenment. Enthused by wisdom and compassion, today in the Buddha's presence, I generate the mind for full awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. As long as space endures, as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain and dispel the miseries of the world.
So, thank you. That's all teaching now finished. So, including myself, we who believe, consider as a follower of Buddha, practice as much as we can. And then those follow of other religious tradition, as I mentioned before, please practice one's own religion seriously, sincerely. And then those non-believer, at least try to be a warm-hearted person, sensible person. Because mental attitude, it actually brings one's own sort of happiness. So, as I mentioned before, you should take more taking care of others, actually more benefit for oneself. So, goodbye, thank you, that's all.
total release and cessation of the afflictions of mind. For example, when Buddhists talk about Buddha Dharma, the real Dharma is the nirvana, that is the cessation of these negative thoughts and emotions.
nyumung kilu tang any nyumung gi pige ta so da zawa han de shero ma shi tum de shi lo gi na ba de shi lo sung gi de yini pa ji tum de kong ma zo sha ba de pa ji sa ba yin sa sha ling yin sa.
Nagarjuna says in one of his works that nirvana or liberation must be understood in terms of the freedom from afflictions of thought and emotions, and also the karmic actions that they give rise to. The sufferings are caused by our karmic actions, and the karmic actions are in turn motivated by the underlying forces of negative thoughts and emotions, and they in turn are produced by or caused by our projections and imaginings, and which in turn have their roots in a false perception of reality. So this false perception of reality here refers to sort of perceiving things and events as enjoying some kind of objective, real, independent existence.
자, 다 안다 데 되게 안다 다가다 샤지신한 거 숨버데 최탐지 동시 다음에 봐. 시대 되게 최남지 인로데 동시 다음에 말이지. 아니 말한주 로리아 아니.
And then the Nagarjuna says that it is the insight into emptiness that can really dispel this this fundamental ignorance or a misperception of the world, a misperception of the reality. So this relates to the third axiom, that all phenomena are empty and devoid of self-existence. And what this suggests is that although in our kind of normal perception, we tend to believe things and events and the world to be in some sense kind of permanent, in some sense real, and in some sense enjoying some kind of independent self-existence. But in reality, through analysis, we find that in reality, they lack such self-existence, they lack such independent existence.
자상가 자아시로 간다 책이 동반니 기 각바지로 사야지 제자자 인도산에 봉지 년표강 수자 와다 라든자데 동반니 투 각바지로 쓰네 라든자 인도산에 주무치 인수 시세 인디 동반니 자네 심지 취
The emptiness, the insight in emptiness is what allows us, what enables us to really dispel and eliminate the negative thoughts and emotions, the afflictions, and also their underlying false perceptions. And also one can say that it is within emptiness that all of these pollutants are cleansed. Therefore, the point is that one has to understand, one's understanding of nirvana in the Buddhist sense must be based on some understanding of emptiness.
다양데 디지털 민두기. 다 나저 거기 삼는 고도가 다 디마 도스 대셰게 뒤치 이메 소리도 다 있는데 아니 뭐 통화 가야랬을나. 또가 단디 디편부샤도 안디 사제한다 남자 숨베 그돌이야. 아니
when we think along these lines, someone might think, oh yeah, it all sound rational, fairly rational. It all seems to make sense. But what evidence do we have that we can take what is being presented here as valid, that these thought processes really mean something? What proof there is? Well, something that is observable, something that we can feel, we can experience. And here I would like to refer to an idea that I find personally very useful, which is traditionally taught in the Sakya lineage. According to this teaching, there is an understanding of what are known as the four valid factors, these being the valid scripture, valid treatise or commentarial literature, and then valid teacher or a spiritual mentor, and a valid experience. Now, it is said that in terms of origin, in terms of origination, of course, the valid scriptures were first taught, and valid commentaries were written on them, and then on the basis of the study of these valid commentaries, there were valid teachers who became masters of this commentary, and then led to these valid experiences. But from the point of view of one's own personal kind of development of conviction, it seems that the order is reversed, that one must first begin with some kind of personal experience. Say, for example, in the case of reflecting upon the 4 axioms, or the empty nature of phenomena, or maybe thinking about the benefits of the qualities of altruism and so on. Unless one has some kind of taste, some kind of personal experience, a glimpse of that, there is less chance that the person will be deeply inspired to carry on. Of course, when we talk about spiritual experiences, there are different levels, there are different degrees. There are profound levels of spiritual experiences and realizations that which I, for one, may not have, but there is also kind of a more initial levels of spiritual experiences which we all have. For example, in my own case, when I think about the virtues and merits of compassion and altruism, as a result of the thought processes, I feel deeply inspired, deeply moved, and this kind of deep inspiration and moving experiences then increases my own admiration towards the masters who personify these great spiritual values and teachings. And then one can also begin to appreciate and also begin to believe that perhaps there is something in the biographies that are of the great masters, where there are narrations, there are accounts of profound spiritual experiences. Of course, when we talk about anecdotal stories, when we talk about biographies, of course, one has to accept the fact that there might be, in some cases, exaggerations, particularly biographies of lamas or masters written by their own disciples. Perhaps sometimes there is an over-enthusiastic presentation of the gurus or the master's spiritual qualities, but still, one cannot dismiss the whole class of biographical. For example, in relation to this point about exaggeration, His Holiness was saying that sometimes when I read very sophisticated commentary written by a great scholar on a short text written by one of his masters, the commentary is so sophisticated and detailed and comprehensive that one begins to even wonder, did the author of the original text, the short text, really knew all of this? So let me carry on with the translation. So His Holiness was saying that, once you have some taste of your own personal experience, when you feel deeply inspired and moved, then you begin to develop deep admiration in the kind of the life of the great masters who embody these spiritual values and teachings. And then, of course, I personally find this way of approaching the teachings very helpful, so that you begin from your own personal experiences, that there is some kind of basis within yourself. And the 8 verses of training the mind by Langri Thangpa is a training for the development of the altruistic aspiration. So these 8 verses of training the mind by Langri Thangpa is a teaching on the practice of bodhicitta, the altruistic intention to attain full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. That wish to attain enlightenment arises on the basis that, it is for the sake of sentient beings that one must attain full enlightenment.
가다 장주 무슨 시대하다 뭐냐 배 가서 우리 그게 샴페인으로 타도 버리자. 샴페인으로 배다 치시들이자. 다가는 신기 배 닝도 타도 버리자. 남주 타도 배 락지리자.
So one could say that this bodhicitta, the altruistic intention, is the highest level of altruism.
저름치 런치면 나올이야. 샹든 주베, 샹든 조르 주베, 랑든 샤람 주바 사드리샤.
As Lama Tsongkhapa says in his great expositions of the path to enlightenment, bodhicitta is this altruistic intention is such that as you are engaging in fulfilling the wishes of other sentient beings, one's own self-interest are achieved as a byproduct in the process. And in a way, one could say this is a very wise way.
I think really wonderful, very wonderful. So the more sort of, I think the stronger feeling of the taking care of other, oneself get immense benefit. Oh, that's something very wonderful. I think very good. 다가는 신다 장주성 팬송이 되잖아요. 아니 장주성 샴페인으로 지금 결혼하잖아. 현다게 배다 초 상상 전에 배서 초 시부직다 가서 우리 배 깔래져가 되디 이 장주성이 초조야 대라도 조용해. 루주가다.
If we think about the qualities, the positive qualities and the merits of bodhicitta, the altruistic intention, we find that one could say that bodhicitta, or the development of altruistic intention, is one of the most effective means by which one can accumulate merits, one can accumulate the positive potentials, one can enhance one's positive spiritual potentials. Overcoming negative impulses and enhancing positive potentials is really the essence of the spiritual path to enlightenment. So one could say that it is one of the most effective, one of the most powerful spiritual practices.
다가는 신기 아다 자본금 아다디 참명 나눠리야. 년들 남는 도지신. 투리를 남는 접던. 그것이 매번 전기에 상주성을 찬사로스. 쉽지도 않아. 년들에 타야 돼 디치야래. 가서 그게 간다 미기 주분 그 추중기 년들에 타와 지기야래. 아다 전주 그 심기 다 년들에 타와 제약이 배탑 가서 미기 주분 그 추중배 견줄 동주를 타고 지 니베셔래도.
And also Maitreya states in one of his aspirational prayers that it is this bodhicitta that can free us from migrations into lower realms of existence, and also it can lead us to higher, fortunate rebirths, and this is also the path that can lead us to the state beyond death. And what is Maitreya saying here is that the practice of bodhicitta really surpasses all forms of ethical practices or morality. It's a far superior path. It's like a technique that is so comprehensive that it contains the element of all the other practices.
아니 닝도라 닝도 보면 샤베이나 차호 데 루주관들 지시하는 소원은 시리 아니 사도 추다 매달로 맨도 건배 신신도 다도 선제 탐지 랑갈 감이 제